The year is 1348. The world is ending. People are dying so fast that there is no time left to bury them. They are dying in the streets, in their homes, in the fields. They are dying so quickly that the living, in their terror, have begun to abandon the dead. The air itself, in the great cities of Europe, is thick with a stench that no one can escape. It is a time of unimaginable fear, and in this terror, a story begins to spread. It is a story whispered in darkened taverns and shouted from church pulpits. A story that offers a terrible kind of comfort, because it claims that this catastrophe is not a random act of nature. This is not the silent, invisible wrath of God. This was a plot. This is the question we are told not to ask. The history books, you see, are closed. They tell us it was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. They tell us it was carried by fleas, which were carried by rats, which travelled on trading ships. It is a very neat story. It is a scientific story. But is it the whole story? On our community page, I recently asked you all a simple question. Do you believe the Black Death was a natural pandemic, or was it something else? 63% of you held to the official history. You believe it was a natural, though terrible, event. But that leaves 37%, more than 1/3 of our community. You felt that something was wrong, that there were too many coincidences, too many strange stories to ignore. You felt that the pandemic was manipulated, or perhaps intentionally unleashed. This journey tonight is for that 37%, and it is for the 63% who deserve to know what unsettling facts that official history so often leaves out. What if the single greatest catastrophe in human history, the event that killed nearly half the world's population, was not an accident at all? What if the Black Death was the first and most successful act of biological warfare ever recorded? These are the kinds of questions that can keep you awake at night. And that is, after all, why we are here. Welcome to Mystery History for Sleep. I am Mr. H. All right, you are comfortable. The lights are low. Your phone is face down. Let us return to that question, that forbidden question. If the plague was indeed a weapon, who pulled the trigger? To understand the conspiracy, you have to go back to the source, back to the year 1348. In the town of Chillon, on the serene shores of Lake Geneva, a group of Jews was arrested. They were accused of a monstrous crime, poisoning the town's wells, and under torture, they confessed. The transcripts of these confessions still exist. A physician named Balavignus described, in agonizing and horrific detail, a vast international plot. He said he had received a package of poison, a powder allegedly made from the hearts of Christians, spiders, frogs, and lizards from a prominent rabbi. He was instructed to sew this powder into a small weighted leather bag and drop it into the town's main well. This confession, extracted under unbearable pain, was not kept secret. It was meticulously copied. It was sent to neighboring towns as an official, terrifying warning. And that warning spread faster than the plague itself. It was the proof everyone was looking for. The world was not ending because of an invisible, random force. It was being murdered. From that moment, the fires began. From Strasbourg to Cologne, the pogroms erupted. Entire communities were rounded up, accused, and burned alive. In the city of Strasbourg, 2,000 people were killed in a single day before the plague had even arrived in the city. The history books call this a tragic, horrific case of scapegoating, a dark chapter of anti-Semitism born of pure panic. Is it scapegoating if the accused confessed? They were tortured, the historians will cry, and they were. The confessions are worthless, they say. But what if the torture was not to invent a story, but to confirm one? What about the sheer number of confessions, from different towns, all telling a similar story? Is that just mass hysteria? Or is it, as some researchers today quietly suggest, a narrative that was being forced, a cover story, for something else? The official story itself has problems, deep problems. The neat narrative of rats and fleas was only solidified in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For 500 years before that, the true cause was a total mystery. And even today, that scientific explanation is beginning to crack. Scientists who try to model the Black Death have a problem. The speed. The plague tore through Europe at an average speed of 2.5 miles a day. It travelled through the dead of winter. It travelled through regions, like Iceland, that had no rat population to speak of. The bubonic plague, the one carried by rat fleas, moves slowly. It has to build up a critical mass in the rat population, what is called a rat fall, before it spills over to humans. And yet, there is almost zero mention of mass rat die-offs in any contemporary account of the Black Death. Furthermore, the plague that struck India in the 1900s, caused by the very same bacterium, had a mortality rate of maybe 30%. The Black Death had a mortality rate of 60, 80, sometimes 90%. It was a different beast entirely. So what was it? Some scientists, like those at the University of Oslo, have proposed a different model. They argue it was not rat fleas, it was human fleas, and lice. That it was a disease spread not from rats to people but from person to person. This would explain the speed, but it opens a darker door. A disease that spreads person to person is a disease that can be controlled, it can be directed, it can be weaponized. And what about the other theories? The ones the history books tend to laugh at? A great comet was seen crossing the sky just before the plague, an interstellar event, as one of our viewers mentioned. In China, reports spoke of noxious vapors and a rain of fire that preceded the sickness. Were these atmospheric disturbances? A change in the air itself? And then, there is the strangest question of all, the one that echoes in the comments section of our own channel. What about the people who did not get sick? The stories of communities strangely unaffected, the rumors of people with oddly shaped features seen near the wells? This is the core of the forbidden question. The official history asks us to believe it was a random, natural tragedy. The mystery suggests something else. To understand the accusation, you must first understand the scene of the crime. We are in the year 1346. The location is Kaffa, a city on the Crimean Peninsula, jutting out into the cold, dark waters of the Black Sea. Kaffa is not just some forgotten medieval town. In 1346, it is one of the most important cities in the world. It is the glittering gateway between East and West. It is the end of the line. This is the last stop on the Great Silk Road, the artery of commerce that connects Europe to the untold riches of the Orient. The city is operated by the Republic of Genoa, the Italian masters of the sea. They are brilliant, ruthless, and fabulously wealthy. Inside the city's massive stone walls, you can hear a dozen languages spoken in the markets. You can smell silks from China, spices from India, and the furs of Siberian animals, all piling up on the docks, ready to be shipped to the great capitals of Europe. Kaffa is a fortress of commerce. It is a symbol of Europe's power, its reach, and perhaps its arrogance. The Genoese inside those walls feel perfectly safe. They are the most sophisticated merchants in the world. They have the strongest walls, they have cannons, and they control the sea. But outside those walls, a different power has gathered, a sea of a different kind, an endless ocean of hide tents and horses, the Golden Horde, the Mongols. They are led by a man named Jani Beg, a descendant of the great Genghis Khan, and Jani Beg is angry. A dispute over trade, a brawl that led to the death of a Mongol merchant, has spiraled into all-out war. For over a year, his army, the most feared military machine on the planet, has laid siege to Kaffa. The siege is a stalemate. The Mongol army is vast, but the walls of Kaffa are strong. The Mongol trebuchets, massive siege engines capable of hurling boulders, pound the ramparts day and night. The Genoese, defiant, simply repair the damage and taunt the attackers from their battlements. The Genoese control the harbour, allowing supplies to come in. They can, in theory, hold out forever. The siege drags on. It is a brutal, grinding affair. And then, in the winter of 1346, something changes. It is not a new weapon. It is not a betrayal from within. It is a rumour, a whisper that begins to spread through the endless camp of the Golden Horde. A new sickness. It starts slowly at first. A guard collapses at his post. A cavalryman complains of a burning fever and a strange, painful swelling in his groin. Within days, he is dead. Then, a dozen more. Then 100. This is the plague. It has travelled with the Mongols, a silent stowaway on their own trade routes, all the way from the remote steppes of Asia. And now, in the close, unsanitary quarters of a massive military encampment, it explodes. The most powerful army on earth begins to dissolve from the inside out. Inside Kaffa, the Genoese watch in stunned disbelief. The relentless pounding of the trebuchets becomes sporadic, then stops entirely. The shouts of the Mongol horde are replaced by a strange, terrible silence, broken only by the crackle of massive funeral pyres. The Genoese merchants congratulate each other. They go to the cathedral to offer thanks. God, it seems, has intervened. Their enemy is being smitten by a divine hand. But Gianni Beg, watching his army disintegrate, is consumed by a frustrated rage. He has been defeated, not by the Genoese soldiers, but by this invisible, unstoppable pestilence. He cannot take the city, but he can make sure that the smug, arrogant merchants inside its walls do not win. He can give them the very curse that has destroyed his army. He issues a new order to the crews of his siege engines. The Mongol soldiers, perhaps wearing cloths soaked in vinegar over their faces, their hands wrapped in rags, begin the grim work. They stop loading the trebuchets with stones. Instead, they begin loading them with their own dead. Imagine that moment, the creak of the massive wooden arms, the strain of the ropes, as a new kind of ammunition is winched into place. A body, swollen, blackened, its features distorted by the grotesque egg-sized tumours, the buboes that give the plague its name. The order is given. The arm swings, and the corpse is launched into the sky. A contemporary Italian notary, a man named Gabriele de Mussi, heard the accounts directly from the survivors who fled Kaffa. He is the one who wrote it down for history. He described the terrible, soaring arc of the dead as they were flung, one after another, over the high walls. He wrote, "The rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. The Genoese defenders were horrified. They could not hide. They could not flee. The bodies rained down, smashing onto the cobblestone streets, disintegrating on impact, a grotesque shower of disease and decay. The Christians," de Mussi wrote, "dumped as many of the bodies as they could in the sea. But it was too late. The stench was overwhelming. The psychological terror was absolute. But the true weapon was invisible. The Genoese believed the sickness was spreading through the smell, through the corrupted air or miasma. This was the accepted medical theory of the day. And in a way, they were not wrong. The pneumonic plague was airborne. But the true delivery system was even more insidious. The real attack came from the passengers riding on those corpses. With every dead body that landed inside the city came a new infusion of infected fleas. Fleas, frantic with hunger, abandoning their cold, dead Mongol hosts, now finding themselves in a new, target-rich environment. And the city's own rat population, drawn to the feast of rotting corpses, would have been the first to investigate. The biological barrier was breached. The plague was inside the walls. This is the moment. This is the smoking gun of the conspiracy. The question the official history books try to soften, to explain away. They ask, was this really a calculated act of biological warfare? Or was it just an act of primal, desperate spite? Did Gianni Beg know he was transferring the contagion? Or was he just, as de Mussi wrote, trying to taint the air, to make the city so unlivable with the smell that the Genoese would be forced to surrender? This is where we must use our reason. The Mongols were not simple barbarians. They were masters of logistics, of psychology, and of warfare. They had just watched this exact disease tear through their own camp. They knew, with absolute certainty, that it spread from person to person. They knew that contact with the sick, or the dead, meant a new infection. They knew exactly what they were doing. This was not an act of rage. It was a calculated, military decision. It was the first and most devastating, documented use of a biological weapon in human history. Gianni Beg could not breach the walls with stone, so he breached them with sickness. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that connects directly back to those confessions in Chillon, Switzerland. The official story of Kaffa mentions catapulting corpses. This infected the air. But the confessions extracted under torture, the ones that lit the fires of the pogroms, spoke of poisoning the wells. Look again at what Gabriele de Mussi wrote. The rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. How did they poison the water supply? The Genoese inside Kaffa were not fools. They would not have been drinking from wells that had rotting body parts floating in them. But what if the attack was twofold? The accounts that survive are fragmented, written in terror. Is it possible that the Mongols were not just flinging their dead? What if they were also flinging the remains of infected animals? What if they were launching bags of something else? Something designed not just to terrorize, but to contaminate the city's cisterns, its water. The tactic described in the Chillon Confessions of a powder in a bag, dropped into a well, is a different tactic than launching a corpse, but the strategy is identical. The intent is identical: to introduce the plague to a fortified, protected population. This is Exhibit A. The moment the Black Death stops being a natural pandemic and becomes a human event, a manipulated event, an act of war. The Genoese inside Caffa were now trapped. The plague exploded through the crowded streets. Their walls, once their salvation, were now the walls of a tomb. There was only one escape route left: the sea. In a desperate, panicked scramble, the remaining survivors, merchants and soldiers, many already incubating the disease without knowing it, fought their way to the harbour. They piled onto their galleys. They cut the mooring ropes. They raised their sails and fled the dying city, praying for the safety of their homes in Italy. They thought they were escaping. They believed they were the lucky few. They had no idea that they were the weapon now. They had become the curse of Johnny Beg. As their ships cut through the waves, they were no longer merchant vessels. They were time bombs. They were carrying the plague to an unsuspecting Europe. But the question is, were they only carrying the plague that Johnny Beg had given them? Or was the horror they unleashed on Sicily, the speed and lethality of it, something else entirely? Something that even the rats and the fleas still cannot fully explain. Imagine the silence. After the terror of the siege, the rain of corpses, the desperate scramble to the harbour, the first few days at sea must have felt like a miracle. There was only the sound of the wind in the single, massive sail, the rhythmic thump and splash of the oars, and the endless, clean horizon of the Black Sea. They had escaped. The men on board those Genoese galleys, merchants who had seen their fortunes evaporate, soldiers who had seen the world's most terrifying army dissolve, they must have looked at each other with the hollow-eyed gaze of survivors. They had made it out of Caffa. They were the lucky ones. They were going home. But they were not alone on that ship. The journey from the Crimea to Sicily is over 1,000 miles. Even with favourable winds, it is a journey of many weeks. And a 14th century galley was not a cruise liner. It was a long, narrow wooden box, packed with over 100 men, often slaves, chained to the rowing benches. It was crammed with cargo bales of silk, barrels of grain, crates of goods, and it was overflowing with refugees from the fallen city. It was dark, it was filthy, it was damp, and it was the most perfect incubator for a pandemic that human history has ever designed. Let's step onto the deck of one of these galleys. Let's call it the San Giovanni. The first few days are fine, but then, on the 5th day out, one of the oarsmen, a man chained to the lowest bench, complains of a sudden chill. He is shaking so violently his chains rattle. By nightfall, he is burning with a fever. The ship's captain, a pragmatic man, likely has him unchained and moved to the ballast, away from the others. He probably assumes it's just a fever, a bad air sickness from the swamps near Caffa. The next morning, the man is dead. His body is covered in strange, dark blotches, and the man who slept next to him is now shivering. Panic does not set in all at once. It is a creeping dread. The captain orders the first man's body to be thrown overboard. A simple, unceremonious splash. But then the second man dies, and this time the ship's cook sees it. A grotesque, purple swelling, the size of a small apple, bulging from the man's armpit. This is not a simple fever. This is it. This is the sickness from Caffa, the curse that Johnny Beg had thrown over the walls. They had not escaped. They had only sealed themselves inside a tomb with the monster. Now, that monster begins its work, and to understand the horror of that journey, you have to understand the other passengers on board, the ones that were never on the manifest. The real masters of the San Giovanni were not the Genoese. They were the Ratus, the Black Rat, the Roof Rat. A medieval ship was a rat's paradise. It was a floating fortress of food and shadow. The main cargo hold was filled with barrels of grain for trade, and sacks of hardtack biscuit and dried meat for the crew. The rats lived in a state of constant, gluttonous bliss. They were in the rigging, in the bilges, in the walls of the captain's own cabin. They were a constant scurrying presence, a rustling in the dark that every sailor was used to. And on the fur of every single one of those rats were the other passengers. The fleas, Xenopsilla chiopis, the true microscopic angels of death. Back in Caffa, an infected rat, its body cooling as it died in the harbour, had sent its own desperate, starving fleas, searching for a new host. They had found one in the warm, dry fur of a ship rat. That rat, healthy for now, had scrambled up the mooring rope of the San Giovanni and joined the colony in the hold. Now, in the middle of the Black Sea, that rat dies. Its body, cooling in the filth of the bilge, unleashes its own small cloud of infected fleas. And those fleas, ravenous, their guts blocked with Yersinia pestis, do what they are programmed to do. They jump onto the nearest warm body, another rat, and so the cycle begins. The plague sweeps through the ship's rat population with an invisible, terrifying speed. The scurrying in the walls begins to quiet down, but the fleas do not die with the rats. They are now homeless and desperate. They move up. They emerge from the cargo hold, from the cracks in the floorboards. They infest the ropes, the sleeping quarters, the woolen blankets of the crew. An oarsman, asleep in the dark, feels a tiny prick on his ankle. He scratches it and thinks nothing of it. He has just been bitten by a flea that has come from a dying rat. He is now patient zero for a new outbreak, entirely contained within the ship. This is the bubonic form. It is methodical. It moves through the crew, one man at a time, over the next several weeks. A man gets a fever, develops the agonizing bubo, and dies. But the San Giovanni is a laboratory, and in this laboratory, the plague evolves. One of the men, let's say it's the first mate, develops a different version. The bacterium, instead of settling in his lymph nodes, gets into his lungs. He starts to cough. At first it's a dry hack, but soon it's a wet, frothy spray of pinkish foam. He is coughing up blood. He has just become a walking, breathing atomizer of death. This is the pneumonic plague. It no longer needs the rats. It no longer needs the fleas. It only needs air. In the cramped, unventilated quarters below deck, where dozens of men live and sleep side by side, every breath is a new infection. The man coughs, and the microscopic droplets, teeming with bacteria, are inhaled by the men next to him. The plague has just changed the rules. It is no longer a slow-moving killer. It is a wildfire. Men who were healthy at the morning watch are coughing up blood by the evening. The entire ship is infected in 48 hours. This is where the ghost ship story is born. Imagine the San Giovanni now, 2 weeks out from Caffa. Of the 150 souls who boarded, perhaps 40 are left alive. The oars are silent. The ship is drifting. The deck is a charnel house. The living are too weak or too terrified to throw the dead overboard. They have locked themselves in cabins, stuffing rags under the doors, but they are already coughing. The captain, his hand shaking, tries to make an entry in his log. He writes of a sickness of the lungs that kills in a single day. He writes that God has abandoned them, and then he too falls silent. This is what happened on the San Giovanni. It is what happened on all 12 of those ships that fled Caffa, and it is, almost certainly, what happened to other ships that we never heard from again. Somewhere, at the bottom of the Mediterranean, lie the wrecks of galleys that never made it to Sicily. Ships that became floating morgues, their entire crews consumed, until they were finally swamped by a storm, their story lost to the sea. And what about the ships that were found? For centuries, the maritime world has been haunted by the legend of the Mary Celeste, the famous ghost ship found sailing with no crew. But this was not a new story. In 1347, the legend was real, and it was happening everywhere. A fishing boat off the coast of Greece, let's say, would have seen one of these Genoese galleys sailing erratically, its sail flapping. They would have hailed it and received no answer. Upon boarding, they would have been met with a vision from hell. A ship full of the dead, bodies slumped at the oars, bodies in the bunks, bodies on the deck, blackened and swollen. And perhaps a single, delirious survivor in the captain's cabin, babbling of a curse, his body burning with fever. The fishermen, terrified, would have fled, taking with them nothing but the story, and perhaps a single rat flea, hidden in the coil of a rope they had touched. This is how the mystery spreads. Not just through the official channels, not just the 12 ships that docked in Sicily, but through these other phantom encounters. These ghost ships that drifted through the shipping lanes, seeding the plague in dozens of small, forgotten ports, long before the historians ever recorded it. Back on the San Giovanni, a handful of men have survived. Maybe 10. They are not immune. They are not special. They are just lucky. Perhaps they were on the open deck when the pneumonic plague swept the hold. Perhaps the fleas just hadn't found them yet. They are skeletal, they are traumatized, but they are alive, and they are sailors. Through sheer, desperate will, these few men manage the sails. They guide the ship. They are going home. They are the ones who will pilot this floating coffin into the harbour at Messina, in Sicily. They are the survivors who will bring the first, horrifying report to the European authorities. They believe they are bringing a warning. They think they are telling a story of a great tragedy at sea. They have no idea that they are the delivery mechanism. They are the triggerman, and they are about to hand Europe a new kind of sickness. A plague so fast, so virulent, so different from what the official story tells us, that it raises an even more disturbing question. The plague from Kaffa was lethal. But was it this lethal? As these ghost ships drifted west, had the monster they carried changed? Had it become something new? Something even the Mongols could never have predicted? It was October 1347. In the port of Messina, on the island of Sicily, the world was still normal. This is the part we so often forget. For the people living in that city, it was just another autumn day. The air was not yet filled with dread. It was filled with the smell of salt from the sea, of citrus from the groves, of olives being pressed. The bells of the churches rang out the hours of prayer, a sound of comfort and absolute certainty. Messina was a crossroads of the known world, a jewel of commerce. Its people were wealthy, sophisticated, and protected. They were protected by their stone walls, by their bustling economy, and above all, by their unshakable faith. They were the centre of the universe. And on the docks, a crowd was gathering. The lookout had spotted them, a familiar, welcome sight, the sails of the Genoese trading convoy, returning from the east. This was a day of celebration. The ships meant money. They meant exotic goods from the Orient, silks and spices. They meant news from the distant, mysterious lands of the Black Sea. But as the 12 galleys grew closer, the celebration died in their throats. The cheers on the dock faded into a confused, uneasy silence. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. There were no sailors lining the rails, no chants from the oarsmen, no merchants waving from the decks. The ships moved with a sluggish, eerie quiet, like phantoms. They did not so much sail into the harbour as they drifted, clumsy and heavy, as if steered by ghosts. A small boat, carrying the harbour master and his officials, rowed out to the lead ship. The smell hit them first. A foul, gut-wrenching stench of decay and sickness that rolled off the galley in an invisible wave. They threw grappling hooks over the side and climbed aboard, their hands covering their mouths. They were met with a vision from hell. The deck was a tangle of corpses. Men slumped over their oars, their bodies already blackened and rotting. The few sailors still alive were spectres. They were skeletons, huddled in the shadows, their eyes wide with a terror that was beyond madness. They were, as one witness would later write, covered in black boils that oozed pus and blood. They didn't beg for help. They didn't shout a warning. They just groaned. They were, as the chronicler Michael of Piazza wrote, so afflicted with sickness that it seemed to cling to their very bones. The Sicilian officials recoiled in horror. They did not know what this was, but they knew it was not of God. They knew it was a pestilence, a curse brought from the pagan lands of the East. Their reaction was immediate, logical, and utterly desperate. They scrambled back into their boat, shouting orders. "Quarantine! No one leaves those ships!" They shouted to the guards on the docks. "Get them out!" In a flurry of panic, the city of Messina tried to save itself. Archers were called to the piers. They fired flaming arrows onto the decks of the death ships. They threatened to sink any man who tried to disembark. The authorities, in a desperate act of public health, ordered the galleys to be cast out of the harbour. They cut the thick mooring ropes, and with poles and threats, they forced the dying, skeletal crews to set their sails and limp back out to sea, to carry their curse with them. The city of Messina watched as the 12 ships, now truly ghost ships, drifted away and vanished over the horizon. And the city breathed a sigh of relief. They had done it. They had faced the apocalypse at their doorstep and turned it away. They had bolted the door, just in time. But the history books, the official, tidy stories, they get this part wrong. They focus on the dramatic, visible act of casting the ships out. They miss the real invasion. They miss what happened in those few, frantic hours while the ships were tied to the dock. The authorities were watching the men. They were not watching the ropes. They were not watching the rats. While the officials were shouting and the archers were drawing their bows, the real army was disembarking. Silently, invisibly. The ratus, the black rat, the ship rat. They were the true, unseen crew of those galleys. And as the ships tied up, they did what rats have always done. They scrambled down the thick, oily mooring lines and onto the docks of Messina. They didn't come in a swarm. They came one by one, a dozen here, a dozen there. They were the perfect spies, melting into the shadows of the warehouses that lined the harbour, warehouses filled with Sicilian grain, cheese, and wine. It was a paradise, and with them, they brought their own microscopic passengers, the Xenopsilla fleas, their guts teeming with Yersinia pestis. The Sicilian authorities had cast out the dying sailors, but they had just welcomed, with open arms, the source of the disease. They had locked the door of their house while the killer was already in the attic, feasting and multiplying. The death ships were gone, but the rats of Messina were now infected. The local rat population, living in the cellars and rafters of the city, began to die, and their fleas, their hosts now cold, began to search for a new source of warmth. A few days passed, a false calm. Then, a dock worker went home to his family. He complained of a sudden, violent chill. His wife wrapped him in a blanket, but he couldn't stop shaking. By morning, he was delirious with fever. When his wife tried to move him, she felt it. A hard, painful lump in his groin, already the size of an egg. By the time the priest arrived, the man was dead. And the priest, after giving the last rites, was the next to fall. This was the moment the city broke. This was not the sickness they had seen on the ships. This was something else. This was in their homes. It wasn't just the buboes. Some people, it was reported, simply collapsed in the street, their blood turning black beneath their skin. Others began to cough, a terrible, wet cough that sprayed a fine mist of blood. The plague had not just arrived, it had detonated. The city of Messina, the great, sophisticated gateway to Europe, descended into chaos. The bonds of civilization, the very things that make us human, dissolved in a matter of days. Michael of Piazza wrote it down, his hand trembling, so that we would know. This disaster, he wrote, was so terrible that fathers abandoned their sick sons, wives fled from their husbands, brothers deserted one another. The sick were left to die alone, their doors barred from the outside. The dead were left in the houses, until the stench became so overpowering that neighbours, in a panic, would break down the doors and drag the bodies into the street. There were no more funerals, no more prayers. And then, the final stage of the collapse. The living began to flee. In a mass hysterical exodus, the people of Messina, the ones who were still healthy, ran. They ran for the countryside. They ran to the neighbouring towns of Catania and Syracuse. They ran, not knowing that they were already infected. They ran, not knowing that the fleas were in their clothes, and the bacteria were in their blood. They had become the new death ships. Each fleeing refugee was a new, mobile outbreak. Messina, the door to Europe, had just become a pressurized nozzle, spraying the pestle. We have been following a story of cities and ships, a story of human panic, of economics, and of war. But we have been watching the shadows on the wall, not the thing casting them. The true protagonist of our story, the antagonist, is not Gianni Beg. It is not a Genoese merchant. It is an organism so small that 8 million of them could fit on the head of a pin. We call it Yersinia pestis. To understand what happened to the world in 1347, we have to stop thinking of this as a disease. A disease is a malfunction, a breakdown. This was not a breakdown. This was an invasion. It was the arrival of an organism so ancient, so sophisticated, and so perfectly engineered for its task, that it borders on the diabolical. Tonight, we are going to profile this perfect killer. We are going to look at its playbook, because this was not a random, clumsy attack. It was a 3-phase military operation, executed with a precision that we are only just beginning to understand. And it is this very perfection, this intelligence, that makes the forbidden question of its origin so much more disturbing. This killer, this microscopic assassin, cannot travel on its own. It requires a vehicle, a delivery system, and like any master strategist, it has chosen its allies perfectly. Its first accomplice is a creature that lives in our shadow, Rattus ratus, the black rat. This is not the sewer rat you might be thinking of. This is the roof rat, the ship rat. It is a smaller, more agile creature. It is a climber. It does not live in the sewers, beneath us. It lives with us. It lives in the thatched roofs of peasant hovels, in the attics of merchants' homes, and most critically, in the dark, warm, food-filled holds of trading ships. It is our constant, unseen roommate. It is the perfect Trojan horse, living inside our walls, eating our food and travelling with us wherever we go. But the rat is only the transport. It is the truck. The true weapon, the hypodermic needle, is its own passenger, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis. This tiny insect is the killer's bridge from the animal world to ours, and this is where the genius of the plague truly begins, because Yersinia pestis does not just use the flea, it hacks it. When a flea bites an infected rat, it drinks in a meal of blood teeming with the bacteria. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria begin to multiply at an insane rate. They form a thick, gelatinous biofilm. This sticky mass grows until it completely blocks the flea's digestive tract. The flea is now, in essence, being starved to death. It becomes frantic. It is ravenously, painfully hungry, but it cannot swallow. It jumps from host to host, biting with a desperate, insatiable aggression. But because of the blockage, it cannot draw the new blood in. Instead, with each failed attempt to feed, it regurgitates. It vomits a slurry of its own stomach contents, thick with Yersinia pestis, directly into the open wound of the bite. This is not a passive transfer. This is a provoked attack. The bacterium has engineered its own delivery system, turning a simple insect into a tiny, spring-loaded weapon of pure, concentrated pestilence. So, the first phase is complete. The Trojan horse, the rat, has carried the hypodermic needle, the flea, into our homes. The needle has now injected its payload. Now, phase 2 begins, the invasion of the human body. This is where the true, terrifying intelligence of this organism becomes clear. This is the part that modern science has only recently uncovered, the part that keeps bacteriologists awake at night. The moment the bacteria enter your bloodstream, your body knows. Your immune system, the most sophisticated defense network on Earth, identifies the invader and sounds the alarm. Your body temperature rises. This heat, this fever, is a weapon. It is designed to kill invaders. But Yersinia pestis is expecting this. The bacterium has a thermal sensor. When it detects a temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, it knows it is inside a warm-blooded mammal, and it initiates a protocol. It fundamentally changes itself. It alters the molecules on its outer membrane, shedding its old coat and putting on a new one. It creates a disguise. It makes itself invisible to your body's first responders. The alarm is blaring, but the sentinels, the white blood cells, are running right past the invader, unable to see it. It has cloaked itself. With this stealth technology active, the bacterium does not run and hide. It does the opposite. It goes on the offensive. It makes a mad dash for the nearest military base, your lymph node. This should be a suicide mission. A lymph node is a fortress. It is a kill box, a fortified garrison packed with your body's most elite soldiers, T cells, B cells, macrophages, all designed for one purpose: to find and destroy invaders. The bacteria arrive. The fortress gates open. The white blood cells, finally sensing something is wrong, swarm the attackers, ready to engulf and destroy them. And this is when the real weapon is revealed. As the white blood cell moves in for the kill, the Yersinia pestis bacterium does something that still beggars belief. It deploys a weapon. It is called a type 3 secretion system. It is, for all intents and purposes, a microscopic hypodermic needle of its own. The bacterium latches onto the white blood cell and, with pinpoint precision, injects a cocktail of potent toxins directly into its cytoplasm. It does not fight the immune cell. It executes it. The white blood cell is paralyzed. Its internal communication system is scrambled. It is frozen, helpless, and then it dies. The fortress's own soldiers are being assassinated, one, by an enemy they cannot even fight. The battle is over, before it has even begun. The fortress has been taken. The lymph node, the very symbol of your body's defense, now belongs to the enemy. Phase 3. occupation and plunder. The bacterium has won the castle. Now it needs to build its army. To do that, it needs resources. Specifically, it needs iron. Iron is the fuel of life, and your body knows this. It keeps all of its iron locked up tight inside proteins like hemoglobin. It is a strategic resource, guarded jealousy. But Yersinia pestis has a key. It begins to release a special molecule called Yersinia bactin. Think of this as a molecular crowbar. This molecule is chemically stickier than your body's own proteins. It hunts down your iron stores and rips the iron molecules away, stealing them, plundering your body's own life force. Now, with an unlimited supply of fuel, and the entire fortress to itself, the bacteria begin to replicate, and they do it with an explosive, terrifying speed. From 1, they become 2, then 4, then 16, then 1,000,000, then 1,000,000,000. They multiply until the lymph node itself, the fortress they conquered, can no longer contain them. It begins to swell, stretch to its breaking point. It becomes hard, tender, and agonizingly painful. It turns a dark, purplish black as the tissue inside dies. This is the bubo. The egg-sized swelling that the chronicles describe is not just a symptom of the disease. It is the result. It is a conquered fortress, a factory teeming with trillions of new invaders, swollen with the dead bodies of your own immune cells and a black broth of stolen iron. Eventually, the bubo bursts. The bacterial army, now trillions strong, floods into your bloodstream, conquering the rest of your body. Your blood turns septic. Your organs fail. Your skin, deprived of blood, begins to blacken and die. This is the perfect killer. It has a perfect delivery system, hacked from a flea. It has a perfect transport, stolen from a rat. It has a perfect cloaking device, triggered by our own body heat. It has a perfect weapon, a needle to execute our immune system. And it has a perfect supply line, a crowbar to steal our iron. This organism is not a blunt instrument. It is a scalpel. It is a masterpiece of biological engineering. And it leaves us with a chilling, unavoidable question. An organism this sophisticated, this specialized to defeat a human immune system, did it really evolve by pure, blind chance in a random marmot on the plains of Asia? Or, as some researchers have dared to ask, is this an ancient weapon, a thing that has been honed, that has studied its enemy for millennia? We have just profiled the perfect killer, but we have only described one of its forms. This was the bubonic form, the one that required the rat and the flea. It was about to get so much worse. The plague was about to unleash its other two faces, the ones that didn't need a vehicle at all, the ones that could travel on the human breath. The bacterium was perfect. It had its transport, its delivery system, and its weapons. But a perfect killer is nothing without a perfect strategy of attack. Yersinia pestis did not conquer the world with a single method. It was a shapeshifter. It was a master of asymmetrical warfare, and it attacked humanity on 3 distinct fronts, with 3 different faces. To the people of the 14th century, these were not 3 forms of the same sickness. They were 3 different deaths, 3 different monsters, all unleashed at the same time. To understand the terror, you must understand this trinity of death. You must see the plague as they saw it. Let us imagine a man, a wool merchant in Florence, in the spring of 1348. Let's call him Alessandro. Alessandro is a man of logic, a man of numbers. He is wealthy, he is respected, and he is not given to the superstitions of the peasants. He has heard the rumors from Sicily. He has heard the priests thundering from the pulpit that this is the wrath of God. Alessandro, however, believes it is a matter of bad shipping, perhaps, or spoiled grain. He is careful. He eats well. He drinks clean wine. One Tuesday, he feels a strange, profound exhaustion. He chalks it up to a long week of calculations. That evening, he feels a chill, a deep, rattling cold he cannot shake. He piles on the furs, but it does not help. He goes to bed. He awakens at midnight, burning with fever. And there is something else, a new sensation, a dull, hot, throbbing ache in his groin. He reaches down, and his fingers touch it. It is a lump. It is hard, the size of a small apricot, and fixed deep in the flesh. It is not a simple knot. It radiates a searing pain. This is the gavocchiolo, the bubo the refugees from Sicily had whispered about. This is the first face of the plague, the bubonic form. This is the classic plague, the one that gave the pandemic its name. This is the result of the flea bite, the result of the bacteria storming the fortress of his lymph node. That lump is not just a swelling, it is a battlefield. It is the physical evidence of his body trying to fight back. Alessandro's world, once so solid and built on numbers, collapses. He knows, in that instant, that he is marked. His next 5 days are a living hell. The fever becomes a delirium. He sees demons in the corners of his room. The chills are so violent, his teeth chatter. He vomits black bile, and the bubo grows. It swells to the size of an orange, the skin stretching over it, turning a dark, bruised purple. It is a constant, screaming agony. His family, in their terror, abandon him. They lock his door from the outside, pushing food into the room with a long pole. He is alone with the monster that is growing on his own body. This form of the plague was the most common, but it was also, perversely, the most merciful, because it offered two things. First, it offered a sign, a visible, tangible enemy, the bubo. The disease was not an invisible ghost. It was a physical lump that could be seen, that could, in theory, be fought. This is why the doctors, in their useless wisdom, were so obsessed with it. They would arrive in their beaked masks, their eyes wide behind glass lenses, and they would attack the bubo. They would lance it with a hot knife, releasing a torrent of black, foul-smelling pus and blood. They would apply poultices of pigeon guts and dried excrement, believing these could draw out the venom. Second, and most importantly, the bubonic plague offered a chance. It was a slim chance, a terrible one, perhaps 40% if you were lucky, but it was not zero. The bubo was a battle, and sometimes, just sometimes, the body won. In our merchant Alessandro, on the 7th day, the bubo, stretched to its absolute limit, bursts on its own. The release of pressure is an agony, but the fever breaks. The poison drains. Alessandro, skeletal, traumatized, and lying in a pool of his own filth, is still breathing. He is a survivor. He will carry the hideous scar for the rest of his life, a mark that will set him apart. He has faced the monster and lived. This was the first face. It was the one you could see. It was the one that gave you time to pray. It was the one you could, just maybe, survive. But it was not the only face. Now, let us imagine another man, a city watchman in London. In that same year, let's call him Thomas. Thomas is not a rich merchant. He is a strong, simple man. His job, for the past 2 weeks, has been a nightmare. He is one of the bikini, the corpse carriers. From dusk till dawn, he walks his cart through the streets, crying, "Bring out your dead." He is paid an enormous wage in silver, but he drinks most of it away, just to numb his mind to the horror. He has seen hundreds of bubos. He has touched the bodies, wrapped them in shrouds. He is not afraid. He is fatalistic. One evening, after dumping his last load of corpses into the great plague pit at Smithfield, he goes to the tavern. He feels fine. He feels strong. He drinks 3 ales. He shares a dark joke with the other watchman. He goes home to his small tenement, kisses his wife, and falls into a deep, exhausted sleep. The next morning, his wife cannot wake him. She shakes him, but he is cold. She looks closer, and she screams. Thomas is dead, but he is not just dead. He is black. His entire body, from his face to his feet, is covered in dark, purplish blotches, as if he had been beaten to death from the inside. His fingers and toes are the color of ink. His wife, in her terror, searches his body. She checks his groin. She checks his armpits. She checks his neck. There is no bubo. There is no swelling. There is no mark. This is the second face of the plague, the septicemic form. This was the hidden dagger. This is what happened when the killer's strategy changed. The flea that bit Thomas perhaps on his hand, as he lifted a body, did not inject the bacteria into his lymphatic system. By sheer, terrible chance, it injected it directly into his bloodstream. There was no battle. There was no fortress to conquer. The bacteria did not storm the castle. They were teleported directly into the throne room. Yersinia pestis had bypassed the body's entire defense network. It did not need to fight the lymph nodes. It was now multiplying, by the trillions, in the blood itself. It was, in essence, turning his circulatory system into a septic highway. The body's response, when it finally realized it was under a total, systemic assault, was catastrophic. It triggered a condition we now call disseminated intravascular coagulation. The blood, in a panic, began to clot everywhere. Tiny, microscopic clots that clogged the capillaries. And paradoxically, this used up all the clotting factors, so the blood also began to hemorrhage. The blackness on Thomas's skin? That was his blood, leaking out of his veins and pooling beneath the flesh. He had bled to death, internally. This form of the plague was the true engine of terror. Why? Because its mortality rate was 100%, and it left no sign. The bubo was a warning. The septicemic plague gave none. It was the reason a person could be, as the chronicles reported, healthy at breakfast and dead by supper. This is what fueled the paranoia. It meant you could not trust your own body. It meant the absence of a symptom was just as terrifying as the presence of one. It was this form, the plague of the blood, that convinced people this was not a disease. It was witchcraft. It was a curse. It was a poison so swift, so silent, that you were dead before you even knew you were sick. This brings us to the final, and most terrifying, face. The one that truly turned a pandemic into an apocalypse. Let us imagine a third person, a priest in a small village outside Paris. Let's call him Father Guillaume. Guillaume is a good man. He is one of the few who did not flee. He believes his duty is to God and his flock. He spends his days and nights moving through his parish, from one smoky, dark hovel to the next, offering last rites. He enters the home of a dying peasant. The man is already unconscious, his body blackened. He is dying of the septicemic plague. As Father Guillaume leans in, anointing the man's forehead and whispering the Latin prayers, the man lets out a final, shuddering cough. It is a faint, pink mist, a fine aerosol of blood and bacteria. Father Guillaume inhales. He has not been bitten by a flea. He has not been cut. He has simply breathed. The Yersinia pestis bacteria are now no longer in his blood. They are in his lungs. The warm, wet, oxygen-rich environment of the human lungs is a perfect new breeding ground. He finishes his rites. He feels fine. He continues his work. The next day, he wakes up with a headache, a tightness in his chest. By noon, he is coughing. It's a dry, hacking cough at first, but by evening the cough changes. It becomes a wet, tearing sound, and it brings up a frothy, bloody sputum. Father Guillaume has just become the third face. He is no longer a man. He is a weapon. He is a human nebulizer. This is the pneumonic plague, and with this evolution, the plague's entire rulebook has been torn up. It no longer needs the rats. The rats are now obsolete. It no longer needs the fleas. The fleas are irrelevant. The disease has just become airborne. It can now travel from person to person to person on the human breath. And this is what explains the speed of the Black Death. This is what allowed it to spread with the speed of a rumor. This is what allowed it to ravage Europe in the dead of winter, when fleas are dormant and rats are hidden. Father Guillaume, his faith overriding his fear, does not isolate himself. He goes to the church to lead Sunday Mass. It is winter. The stone walls of the church are freezing. The entire village, his entire surviving flock, is huddled together inside for warmth, packed shoulder to shoulder in the pews. Father Guillaume stands at the altar, and he coughs. The mist, invisible in the candlelight, settles over the front rows. He hears confessions. A parishioner whispers their sins through the screen. Father Guillaume, his chest rattling, coughs. He visits the local convent to give communion to the nuns. He coughs. In 48 hours, Father Guillaume is dead. He drowns in his own bloody fluids. But in those 2 days, he has personally infected over 100 people. His entire congregation, the nuns, the other priests. And the mortality rate for this form, it is not 60%. It is not even 90%. It is 100%. No one who contracts the pneumonic plague survives. This was the trinity of death. A visible monster you might escape, a hidden killer you could not see, and an airborne ghost you could not avoid. This is what the physicians in 1348 were truly facing. They were trying to fight 3 different wars at once, with no weapons, no armor, and no understanding of their enemy. They were trying to lance the buboes, while the real killer was in the blood. They were trying to fight the blood, while the real killer was in the air. It was a perfect, unwinnable war. And as the physicians, in their useless, beaked masks, stepped back in horror, admitting their total, absolute failure. The rest of society began to fracture. When medicine fails, when prayer fails, the human mind, in its desperate, terrified search for an answer, does not stop looking. It just starts looking for someone to blame. The doctor has failed you. His poultices of dried feces and pigeon hearts have done nothing. His polished lancing knife, used to drain the black, swollen bubo in your child's neck, has only brought a new, searing pain, a final scream, and then a terrible silence. The priest has failed you. He heard your confession. He took your silver. He anointed your child with holy oil and spoke the Latin rites, and your child died anyway. Now, you hear, the priest himself has locked the church doors and is rumoured to be dying, his prayers unanswered. God, it seems, is silent. The world you knew, the world of order, of faith, of medicine, has proven to be a lie. It is a house of cards, and it is collapsing all around you. You are in a state of freefall. You are surrounded by an invisible, incomprehensible force that is erasing your family, your neighbours, your entire city. The human mind cannot exist in that kind of vacuum. It cannot accept a random, senseless, invisible killer. If the air is poisoned, it is because someone poisoned it. If the water is deadly, it is because someone made it so. Fear needs a face. It needs an agent. It needs a who. And in the year 1348, in the desperate, terrified heart of Christian Europe, a new story began to take shape. It was a whisper that grew into a roar. It was a story that, for the first time, made sense. It explained everything. It explained why the plague had come. It explained why it was so deadly. And it explained why some people seemed strangely, terribly unaffected. Tonight, we look at the outliers, the suspects, the people who stood outside the circle of suffering, and who, in their separateness, became the targets of a terror that was, perhaps, even darker than the plague itself. This is the story of the great well-poisoning conspiracy. The accusation, when it finally coalesced, was not complicated. It was brutally simple. The Jews, it was said, had launched a secret, coordinated war against all of Christendom. From a hidden headquarters in Toledo, Spain, the great rabbis of the world had allegedly concocted a deadly poison, a powder made, as the stories claimed, from consecrated Christian hearts, from spiders, from frogs, and from lizards. This poison was then distributed in small leather pouches, carried by a secret network of agents travelling merchants, beggars, even lepers who were under orders to deposit the poison in the wells, the springs, and the rivers of every Christian town. They were, the story went, poisoning the world. To the modern ear, this sounds like pure, unhinged madness. It is the textbook definition of a conspiracy theory, born of panic and prejudice. And this is, of course, the official story. The history books close the case very neatly. They call it mass hysteria. They label it a tragic chapter of medieval anti-Semitism. They tell us it was a lie, a delusion. But here, at Mystery History, we do not close cases so neatly. The questions our own viewers ask, the questions that 37% of you are thinking, are valid. How did a rumour this specific, this detailed, spread so far, so fast? Why did so many people confess to it? And the most disturbing question of all, the one that our viewer King, Morty, pointed out, what about the stories that the Jewish areas were strangely unaffected? Let's begin with that, because that is the evidence that the people of the 14th century saw with their own eyes. Imagine you are a baker in Strasbourg. You live on a crowded, filthy street. Every morning the bashini, the corpse carriers, push their carts past your door, and every morning the pile of bodies is higher. You have lost 2 children. Your wife is sick. The sound of wailing from your neighbours' houses is constant. But then, you walk 2 streets over, to the tall, narrow gates of the Judengasse, the walled-in Jewish quarter, and you hear nothing. You don't hear the wailing. You don't see the death carts. You see people, living, conducting business. The rumours start to fly. They aren't dying. The plague stops at their gate. They must be protected. They must be the ones doing it. Was this true? Were they truly unaffected? The historical record is complex. The official story rushes to tell us, no, of course not. And in many places, this is correct. In the papal city of Avignon, for example, the Jewish cemetery was overwhelmed. A massive plague pit had to be dug, and the mortality rate was just as catastrophic as in the Christian sectors. The plague did not, in fact, distinguish by religion. But the perception on the ground was different, and in some places, that perception may have been based on a startling truth. In many towns, the Jewish mortality rate was significantly lower. Why? Historians offer a mundane answer: segregation. Because they were distrusted, Jewish communities were walled off, living in their own quarters. When the plague struck, this forced isolation, this social distancing that was meant to be a punishment, accidentally became their salvation. They had, in essence, been quarantined from the Christian population for centuries. But there is a deeper, more fascinating theory, one that our viewer Barbara suggested. It was not their isolation, it was their habits. In the 14th century, Christian Europe was filthy. We have discussed this. People rarely bathed. They lived in their own waste. They ate with unwashed hands. The Jewish community, however, lived by a different code. They lived by halakha, the body of Jewish law. And this law required a level of hygiene that was utterly alien to the rest of Europe. They were required to wash their hands, the netilat yadayim, before eating bread. They were required to wash their hands after using the latrine. They were required to wash their hands upon waking. Their faith mandated that their food be prepared in a specific, clean way. Their laws required them to bathe regularly. Think about that. In a world being destroyed by a disease transmitted by fleas and filth, one community, had a mandated, centuries-old religious code of personal hygiene. They weren't strangely unaffected. They weren't protected by the devil. They were simply clean. What the terrified Christian population saw as dark magic may have just been soap and water. The secret knowledge that protected them was not a pact with Satan. It was a basic understanding of sanitation, passed down as divine law. But this logical explanation was invisible to the medieval mind. What they saw was a people who were not dying, while their own children were. The conspiracy theory was not just plausible, it felt true. And then came the confessions. This is the darkest part of the mystery, the part that cemented the lie into truth. It began, as we mentioned, in Chillon, Switzerland. In 1348, a group of Jews was arrested. They were taken to the dungeons of the castle, and they were tortured. We must be very clear about what medieval torture meant. It was not enhanced interrogation, it was the rack. It was the application of fire and iron and weights with a clinical precision designed to do one thing: produce a confession. A man will say anything to make the pain stop. And so, they confessed. A man named Balavignus, a Jewish physician, broke under the torture. He confessed to the entire, elaborate plot, and the town notary, pen in hand, wrote it all down. This document still exists. It is one of the most chilling artifacts in history. Balavignus admitted that a rabbi from Toledo, in Spain, had sent him a package. It contained, he said, a powder made from the crushed basilisk, though he later changed it to spiders, frogs, and the hearts of Christians. He confessed that he was part of a network. He named other men. He described, in detail, how he had sewn the poison into a bag, weighted it with a stone, and dropped it into the well at the center of town. This was it, the proof. The official story tells us, rightly, that this document is worthless as evidence of a crime. It is a script, dictated to a man in agony by his own torturers. But here is the mystery, the part that mystery history cannot ignore. How did these confessions, from different towns, tortured by different men, end up corroborating each other's details? How did the torturers in Chillon seem to know the names of rabbis in France to ask about? The common explanation is that the Chillon confession was copied and sent to other towns, and those other towns then used that script to torture their local Jews. It created a horrific feedback loop. But this opens a new, darker question. What if the conspiracy was real, but the culprits were wrong? What if the well poisoning story was not a complete fabrication? What if it was a cover story? Let us look at the city of Strasbourg. February 14th, 1349, Street Valentine's Day. The plague, we must note, had not yet arrived in Strasbourg. The panic had not yet begun. There were no bodies in the streets. There was only opportunity. The city's powerful trade guilds, the butchers, the bakers, the tanners, were deeply, hopelessly in debt, and their primary creditors, were the Jewish moneylenders. The guilds went to the town council and demanded that the Jews be arrested for poisoning the wells. The city's mayor, a man named Peter Swarber, refused. He stood up for them. He said there was no evidence. So the guilds did something extraordinary. They staged a coup. They raised a citizen mob, stormed the city hall, and deposed the entire city council. They installed a new mayor, one who would do their bidding. And on February 14th, they acted. This was not a panicked mob or mass hysteria. This was a cold, calculated, premeditated act. They rounded up the entire Jewish population of Strasbourg, 2,000 men, women, and children. They marched them to the Jewish cemetery, where a massive wooden platform had been built. They offered a choice: convert to Christianity or burn. Most refused. They were tied to the platform. The structure was set alight. In a single day, an entire community was erased from the earth. And then, the new city council passed its final, revealing law. All property belonging to the murdered Jews was seized. All debts owed to them were declared null and void. The guildmasters were free. The well-poisoning story was a lie. We know this. But it was a lie with a purpose. It was not a product of fear. It was a tool of greed. It was a justification for the largest, most successful act of mass murder and financial cleansing in the city's history. The plague, which arrived a few weeks later, was simply the perfect excuse. The sane voices were drowned out. Pope Clement VI, from his palace in Avignon, was furious. He issued 2 papal bulls, formal decrees from God's representative on earth. He called the well-poisoning story a monstrous lie. He pointed out, with perfect logic, that Jews were dying just as much as Christians. He pointed out that the plague was raging in lands where no Jews had ever lived. He threatened to excommunicate any person who harmed them. And the result? Absolutely nothing. The world had gone mad. The Pope's voice was a whisper in a hurricane. The people, it seemed, no longer cared what the Pope said. They cared about what they saw or what they thought they saw. This leads us to a final, strange piece of the puzzle. A comment from our own community. A viewer named King, Morty, mentioned the stories. Not just of Jews, but of people with oddly shaped schnozzes poisoning wells. This is a strange, specific, and recurring detail in the chronicles. They speak of strangers, of foreigners, of men in strange robes. We have just proven that the Jewish conspiracy was a horrific lie, a cover for financial gain. But what if the core of the story, the well poisoning, was not a complete fabrication? What if the terror-stricken people of Europe, in their madness, had actually, accidentally, stumbled upon the truth? What if someone was poisoning the wells? But it was not the Jews. It was someone else. Someone everyone had forgotten about. Someone who also lived on the fringes. And what about those other strange figures? The ones who appeared in the middle of the plague, the ones who walked toward the sickness, not away from it. The men in the long black cloaks, their faces hidden behind those grotesque bird-like masks. Who were they? And what secret did they know, that they hid behind those glass eyes and perfume-filled beaks? When the healers are helpless and the heavens are silent, the human mind does not simply give up. It creates its own solutions. It invents new saviors and new monsters. In the first year of the Great Dying, as the structures of the old world dissolved, the streets of Europe were stalked by 3 new, terrifying figures in robes. They were not the familiar priests or monks of the old world. These were something new, something born from the crucible of the plague itself. They were the fanatic, the physician, and the phantom. And the most terrifying part? 2 of them were real. The first figure, the fanatic. Before the man in the strange bird mask ever appeared, there was another, a figure who announced his arrival, not with silence, but with a sound. Imagine a town in Germany, in the year 1348. The town is paralyzed. The death carts are making their rounds. The doors are marked with crosses. The very air is thick with the sweet, cloying stench of the dead. And then, you hear it, a sound from the hills. It is not the ringing of a church bell. It is the sound of chanting, and underneath it, a steady, wet, rhythmic slapping. They arrive at dusk. A procession of 200 people marching in perfect formation, 2 by 2. They are barefoot. Their heads are bowed, faces hidden by hoods. They are wearing dark, heavy robes, marked with a simple red cross. They are the flagellants, the brothers of the cross. They do not speak. They march directly to the town square, the terrified, desperate citizens creeping out of their homes to watch. This is not a rabble. This is organized. This is a ritual. Their leader, the master, raises his hands. The chanting stops, and as one, the figures in robes strip to the waist. The crowd gasps. The bodies of the men are not the bodies of healthy peasants. They are a roadmap of old scars, of torn flesh, of wounds that have never been allowed to heal. And then they uncoil their whips. These are not simple whips. They are the scourge. They are thick leather thongs, 3 to a handle, and knotted into the end of each thong are sharp, iron spikes, like needles. The master begins a low, mournful chant, and the whipping begins. The sound is horrific. It is the sound of metal biting into flesh, over and over. They whip themselves in a synchronized rhythm, a terrifying public performance of self-mutilation. They strike their own backs, their chests, their legs, until the blood flows freely, splattering the cobblestones, the walls of the houses, and the faces of the nearest spectators. This is not just penance. This is theatre. They throw themselves to the ground in choreographed patterns, sometimes in the shape of a cross. Sometimes they lie on their backs while the next man in line whips them. They do this for hours, until the square is slick with their blood, and their bodies are a pulp of raw, torn meat. To us, this is madness. To the people of the 14th century, this was hope. Remember, the church had failed them. The priests were dying. The prayers were not working. The entire institution of salvation had proven powerless. Into this vacuum of faith stepped the flagellants. They were a new, DIY religion. They were a heresy. Their secret, the belief that drove them, was that the church had become too corrupt to save mankind. They believed that God was so angry at the world, at the vanity of the nobles, at the greed of the priests, that the plague was his final judgment. And they believed that the only way to appease this angry God was through an act of extreme, voluntary suffering. They were, in their minds, reenacting the suffering of Christ. They were offering their own blood to pay the debt of mankind's sin. Their theology was simple. Their 3.5 day pilgrimage of self-torture, 1 day for each year of Christ's life, was a new sacrament. It did what the church's rituals could no longer do. It guaranteed absolution. It washed away all sin, bypassing the priests, the bishops, and the Pope entirely. This is why the Pope, Clement VI, was so terrified of them. They were not just a nuisance, they were a revolution. They were a direct challenge to his authority. But for the common person, they were saints. They were heroes. They were the only ones doing anything. When they left a town, the crowds would rush forward, dipping rags into the fresh blood on the stones, believing it was holy, that it was a miraculous relic that could ward off the plague. And here is the terrible, tragic irony. These figures in robes, these fanatics who believed they were God's cure, they were, in fact, one of the plague's most effective vectors. Think about it. They were a mass movement, traveling from an infected town to a clean one. They gathered the entire population of a village into a crowded, enclosed square for hours. They were whipping themselves, sending fine mists of blood and sweat into the air, and they were, almost certainly, coughing. They were a walking, talking, self-flagellating super-spreader event. They were, in all likelihood, the primary delivery system for the pneumonic plague. The flagellants were the first figure in robes. They were born of faith, and they spread the disease they sought to end. The second figure, the physician, when faith failed, and the bloody theatre of the flagellants proved useless, the second figure appeared. This one was different. He did not arrive with a crowd. He did not make a sound. He appeared, alone, in the doorway of your home, a silhouette against the light. He was the plague doctor. This is the image that has been burned into our collective nightmares. The long, black, waxen cloak that reached to the floor. The wide-brimmed hat, often black, which identified him as a doctor. The leather gloves. The long wooden stick, which he used to poke the patient, to lift their bedclothes, to feel their pulse, to examine them without the contamination of human touch. And the mask, the terrifying, surreal, bird-like mask, a long, hollow beak, with round glass eyepieces. The audience comments, the folklore, they remember this figure, but who was he? Was he a hero? A scientist? A ghoul? The answer is, He was a municipal employee. He was a government contractor. You see, in the first wave of the plague, the real doctors, the learned, university-trained physicians did one of two things. They either fled to their country estates with their wealthy patrons, or they died, just as fast as their patients. The man in the beak mask was what was left. He was the second stringer. Sometimes he was a young, ambitious doctor who had no reputation to lose and everything to gain. Sometimes he was a barber surgeon, more used to cutting hair and pulling teeth than fighting a pandemic. Sometimes he was a complete fraud, a man who had never been to medical school at all, but who saw a chance to earn an astronomical wage, because these men were hired by the city. As the plague returned, again and again, cities like Florence and Milan realized they needed a public health response. They hired these dottori della peste at enormous salaries, and their job was not, in fact, to cure anyone. Curing was impossible. Everyone knew this. No, their real job was administrative. They were the bureaucrats of the apocalypse. Their primary function was to be a data collector. They walked from house to house to count the dead. They were the ones who would officially examine a body, confirm it was the pestilence, and report the death to the city's health magistrates. They were the ones who served as official witnesses for the wills of the dying, and they were the ones who would authorize the bikini to come and take the body. They were, in short, the men who decided which houses needed to be sealed, which families needed to be quarantined. They were the public face of a new, cold, state-sponsored system of control, and they needed to protect themselves. This brings us to the mask. The beak. Why a bird? The symbolism is debated. Some say birds were wrongly thought to spread the disease, so the mask was a sympathetic magic to draw the plague away from the doctor. A more likely theory is simply that birds were seen as creatures that lived apart, that flew above the filth of the world, and were therefore clean. But the function of the mask, that we know. It was based on the miasma theory. The dominant scientific belief of the age was that the plague was not a germ. It was a smell, a bad air, a noxious vapor that rose from the rotting dead, from swamps, and from the poisoned earth. The beak was a filter. It was a primitive, terrified attempt at a gas mask. Before the doctor put on the mask, the long, hollow beak would be stuffed with a potent, aromatic cocktail of herbs, spices, and dried flowers. This was the theriac. It could contain juniper berries, ambergris, mint, camphor, cloves, rose petals, and most importantly, a sponge soaked in vinegar. The theory was that if the doctor breathed only this good, clean air, the bad air of the plague could not enter his body. And here is the second beautiful irony of our story. The theory was completely wrong. The miasma theory was nonsense. But the costume worked. It worked for all the wrong reasons. The plague doctor, in his bird mask, was not filtering out a bad smell, but the long waxen cloak, a forerunner to a modern hazmat suit, was slick. It was non-porous. A flea, the true carrier of the bubonic plague, could not live in it, and could not easily bite through it. The leather gloves protected his hands. The mask, while useless against a miasma, created a buffer, keeping him from inhaling the airborne droplets of a pneumonic plague victim. And the stick, which he used to keep patients at a distance, was the most effective tool of all: social distancing. The plague doctor, a figure of terror, a man operating on a completely flawed scientific model, was accidentally one of the first humans to invent and deploy effective personal protective equipment, PPE. He was a fraud who was also, by pure, terrified chance, a genius. He was the figure in robes who walked into the plague, and often was one of the few who walked back out. The third figure, the phantom. The flagellant failed. The doctor failed. Faith was powerless. Science was useless. The bodies continued to pile up. And so, the human mind, in its final act of desperation, created a third figure. This one was not a fanatic. He was not a physician. This one was an explanation. A viewer asked a haunting question. Then why did some people report seeing people in robes and scythes in the fields surrounded by crap? This is not a historical sighting. This is something far more important. This is a psychological symptom. This is the birth of an icon. Before the Black Death, the concept of death in art was very different. Death was a transition. It was a solemn, religious moment. You would be called. You would confess. You would be given your last rites. and an angel would come to guide your soul to heaven. It was the good death. The plague destroyed the good death. Death was no longer a gentle transition. It was a violent, sudden, anonymous theft. It was not a single angel coming for a single soul. It was a harvester. And this is where the image of the Grim Reaper is born. The figure in the black robe, the robe of a mourning priest or monk, was not new. But the scythe was new. Why a scythe? Because the plague did not select. It did not choose. It mowed. A farmer with a scythe does not pick one stalk of wheat and leave another. He cuts them all down, in a great, sweeping, impersonal motion. This is what the people of the 14th century saw. The plague was moving through their villages, cutting down the good, the bad, the rich, the poor, the young, the old, with a terrifying mechanical indifference. The man in the robe with the scythe was not a monster. He was a metaphor. He was the only thing that made sense. This metaphor became the dominant art form of the age, the danse macabre, the dance of death. All across Europe, on the walls of churches and in new, cheap woodcuts, this image appeared. It showed a figure in robes, a skeleton, a decaying corpse leading a great procession, and in that procession was everyone. The skeleton holds the hand of the Pope, whose triple tiara is falling off. The skeleton grabs the robe of the king, whose crown is useless. The skeleton dances with the wealthy merchant, who tries in vain to offer a bag of gold. The skeleton pulls the plough from the peasant, the sword from the knight, and the baby from the cradle. This art was not meant to be scary. It was meant to be comforting. In a world that had been shattered, a world of corrupt priests and greedy nobles, the dance macabre was the most profoundly revolutionary and subversive idea of its time. It was the ultimate leveler. It was a public declaration that the entire, rigid, feudal system was a lie. The plague had proven that the Pope, the king, and the noble were not better. They were not chosen by God. They were just as fragile, just as naked, and just as terrified as the poorest farmer. The man in the robe with the scythe, the figure our viewer asked about, was the phantom born of the trauma. He was the one, single, democratic force in a world of total inequality. He was the great equalizer. He was the one figure who could not be bribed, who could not be fooled by a title, and who would, in the end, invite everyone to the same, final, terrible dance. We have now met the three figures in robes, the fanatic who spread the plague, the doctor who tried to fight it, and the phantom that explained it. But all of these, the flagellant, the doctor, the reaper, were just human reactions to the event. They were attempts to answer the why and how. The official story of Yersinia pestis is the modern scientific answer to that same how. But what if both are wrong? What if the official story of Yersinia pestis and the medieval story of miasma are both just cover stories? What if the Black Death, the single most devastating event in human history, was not a bacterium? What if it was not a bad air? What if it was something else entirely? A different kind of killer, a hemorrhagic fever, something more like an ancient Ebola, a disease that leaves no trace, and whose true origin remains a terrifying unsolved mystery. The sky was wrong. Before the boils, before the coughing, before the death carts clogged the narrow streets, the sky was wrong. People remembered it. They wrote it down. Not just the poets and the mystics, but the sober chroniclers, the monks diligently recording the year's events in their abbey scriptoriums. They noted unusual conjunctions of planets, eclipses that seemed too dark, comets that lingered too long, their tails like pale, accusatory fingers pointing down at the earth. They recorded unnatural fogs, strange smells on the wind, rains that seemed off. In the medieval mind, the connection was absolute. The heavens were not a distant, indifferent clockwork. They were a message. The macrocosm above directly influenced the microcosm below. A disturbance in the celestial order must precede a disturbance on earth. Disease, famine, war. These were not random events, they were the earthly echoes of heavenly turmoil. And in the years leading up to 1347, the heavens seemed particularly troubled. A great comet had blazed across the sky in 1345. Its appearance filled observers with a sense of profound unease. Comets were harbingers, celestial messengers, and their news was rarely good. Then there were earthquakes reported, unusually violent tremors that shook Italy and Germany, said to release foul vapors from the cracked earth. Unusual weather patterns brought floods and droughts. To the people watching, the signs were clear. God, or perhaps the cosmos itself, was angry. The stage was being set for a catastrophe. And when the plague finally arrived, carrying with it that inescapable, sickeningly sweet stench of decay, the explanation seemed obvious. The air itself had been poisoned. This wasn't just a peasant superstition. This was the highest, most sophisticated scientific understanding of the age. In October of 1348, King Philip VI of France, desperate for answers as the pestilence marched toward Paris, commanded the most respected medical body in the world, the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris, to investigate the cause. Their response, delivered after solemn deliberation, became the definitive scientific explanation for the Black Death for centuries. It was precise, it was learned, and it was entirely focused on the sky. The learned masters declared that the primary cause was a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, which had occurred, they calculated with astonishing precision, at 1 hour past noon on March 20th, 1345. This celestial alignment, they explained, was profoundly malignant. Jupiter, hot and moist, drew up evil vapors from the earth. Mars, hot and dry, then ignited these vapors, corrupting them. Saturn, cold and dry, compounded the problem, preventing the poisoned air from dispersing. This great pestilence in the air, they wrote, had then been spread across the globe by frequent gusts of thick, wild, and southerly winds. This corrupted air, this miasma, when breathed in, penetrated directly to the heart, corrupting the substance of the spirit and extinguishing the life force. It sounds like pure astrological fantasy to us now, but we must try to understand it through their eyes. This was not magic, this was science. They were applying the best knowledge they had, derived from the revered texts of Aristotle and Galen, interpreted through the lens of astrology, which was considered a legitimate branch of natural philosophy. They were observing the world, the sick, the dying, the smell, and fitting it into their established framework. And the miasma theory. It felt right. It aligned perfectly with what people were experiencing. The most terrifying thing about the plague zones was the stench, an overpowering, inescapable odor of death and decay. It clung to clothes, to hair, to the very stones of the buildings. It was logical, based on direct sensory evidence, to conclude that this foul air was the disease. You breathed it in, and you died. Their recommendations flowed directly from this theory. Avoid the corrupted air. Seek high ground, where the winds were cleaner. Stay indoors during damp or foggy weather. Burn aromatic woods, juniper, ash, vine in great bonfires in the streets, hoping the smoke and heat would purify the atmosphere. Carry pomanders, small metal balls filled with ambergris, cloves, and other powerful scents, holding them constantly to the nose to create a personal bubble of good air. This is the origin of the nursery rhyme phrase, pocket full of posies. Those small bouquets were not decorative. They were believed to be tiny, fragrant shields against the deadly miasma. Pope Clement VI, sitting between his two massive fires in Avignon, was following the most advanced medical advice available. He was creating a fortress of heat and smoke against the poisoned sky. Even the avoidance of bathing stemmed from this theory. Hot water opened the pores, they believed, making the body more vulnerable to the miasma seeping in. The irony, of course, is that while they were avoiding water, they were creating a paradise for the actual carriers, fleas and lice thriving on unwashed bodies. The miasma theory was elegant, it was comprehensive, and it was tragically, catastrophically wrong about the cause. But here is where the mystery deepens. Was it wrong about everything? While the conjunction of planets did not create a poison, the people of the 14th century were not imagining the atmospheric anomalies. The chronicles are too consistent, too widespread. They did report strange fogs. They did report unusual smells preceding outbreaks. They did report bizarre weather. Remember Gabriele de Musi's account from Kaffa? He mentions the catapulted corpses tainting the air and poisoning the water. We focused on the corpses, but what if the tainted air was more than just the smell of decay? And what about the even stranger reports? The ones dismissed as pure fantasy? De Musi himself, relaying tales from the east where the plague originated, wrote of a rain of frogs, serpents, lizards, scorpions, and venomous beasts. He spoke of a vast column of fire and stinking smoke that fell from the heavens. Pure apocalyptic imagery? Perhaps. But what if these were garbled, terrified descriptions of real, poorly understood events? Consider the viewer comment. Was it maybe a debris divided by follow-up from some interstellar divided by comet? Questions over questions. The answers are uncertain. This touches on a fringe, but persistent, set of modern theories. Could a significant atmospheric event have coincided with the plague's arrival? Not causing it directly, perhaps, but contributing? Some researchers point to massive volcanic eruptions in the mid-14th century, like the Samalas eruption in Indonesia around 1257, whose atmospheric effects lingered for decades, potentially altering global climate and perhaps releasing vast quantities of toxic gases. Could the stinking smoke have been volcanic smog? Others, more controversially, look to the sky. Could a comet breaking up in the atmosphere, or a significant meteor impact, have deposited dust or even unknown organic material into the environment? Could this have weakened populations, making them more susceptible to the Yersinia pestis bacterium when it arrived? Or could it, as the most extreme theories propose, have been the source of the pathogen itself? We are deep in the territory of speculation here, but the reports exist. The medievals believed the sky was involved. They believed the air was poisoned, and they acted accordingly. Their belief in the miasma shaped everything. It dictated public health measures, the bonfires, the sealing of houses to keep the bad air out, or perhaps in. It influenced personal behavior, the carrying of posies, the avoidance of the sick, lest you breathe their corrupted air. It even affected the very architecture of fear, the plague doctor's beaked mask, designed solely to filter the air breathed by the wearer. The tragedy is that this intense focus on the air, on the vast, invisible miasma, may have blinded them to the real killer operating at their feet. They were looking at the sky, while the true enemy was jumping from a rat, hiding in their bedclothes, or travelling on the cough of their neighbour. Or perhaps the medievals weren't entirely wrong. Perhaps the air was compromised, not by planets, but by something terrestrial or even extraterrestrial that we still don't fully understand. Perhaps the poisoned sky was not the cause of the Black Death, but the condition that allowed it to become the apocalypse it was. Perhaps it weakened humanity just enough for Yersinia pestis to deliver the killing blow. The official history dismisses the poisoned sky as pure superstition. But the question lingers, whispered across 7 centuries. Were they seeing omens? Or were they seeing evidence? And if the air itself was suspect, what did that mean for the most fundamental element of all? The water they drank? The sky was poisoned. The water was suspect. The very air you breathed carried an invisible killer. Your doctor offered useless, painful remedies. Your priest offered prayers that went unanswered. Your family might lock the door and leave you to die alone. Where do you turn when every pillar of your world has crumbled? What happens when the fear becomes so absolute, so constant, that it burns itself out, leaving behind only a hollow, echoing numbness? This is Chapter 10, The Collapse. This is the story of what happens when society itself begins to die. It did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing implosion. It began with the small things, the everyday routines that hold a community together. First, it was the burials. In the early days of the plague's arrival in a city like Florence or London, they tried to maintain tradition. Each death was an individual tragedy. A body would be washed, wrapped in a shroud, placed in a wooden coffin. The family would hold a vigil. A priest would lead a small procession to the local churchyard. The bells would toll. A grave would be dug. Prayers would be said. This was the good death, the proper Christian way to depart the world. But the plague rendered the good death obsolete. The numbers became simply impossible. A churchyard that might normally see 1 or 2 burials a week was suddenly receiving 50 a day. The gravediggers, themselves falling sick and dying, could not keep up. The consecrated ground filled up, then overflowed. Giovanni Boccaccio, watching Florence disintegrate, described the grim alternative. So many corpses would arrive in front of a church every day that the amount of holy ground for burials was certainly insufficient. When all the graves were full, huge trenches were dug, and into them the new arrivals were dumped by the hundreds. Imagine the psychological impact of this. For 1,000 years, the proper burial of the dead had been one of the most sacred duties of a Christian community. It was the final act of respect, the moment the soul was commended to God. Now, that ritual was gone. Your loved one, your child, your wife, your father, was not given a name, a prayer, a plot of earth. They were simply disposed of. Tipped off a cart into a gaping pit with hundreds of strangers, covered with a thin layer of dirt, like lasagna with cheese, as another chronicler starkly put it. This wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a spiritual catastrophe. It severed the connection between the living and the dead. It suggested that individual lives, individual souls, no longer mattered. You were just part of the count. As the burial system collapsed, so did the basic functions of law and order. Boccaccio wrote that the ministers of the law, notaries, and officials had either died or were so short-staffed they simply stopped working. Courts closed. Records ceased to be kept. Contracts became meaningless. In the ensuing vacuum, a strange and terrifying kind of freedom emerged. Every person, Boccaccio noted with horror, was free to do as they pleased. For some, this meant a descent into utter lawlessness. With no one to enforce property rights, abandoned houses became fair game. People simply moved into the grand homes of the wealthy dead, looting what they could find, living in squalid luxury for a few days or weeks until the plague claimed them too. Taverns, their owners often dead, were broken into, the wine flowing freely until the barrels ran dry. Others saw this breakdown not as an opportunity for indulgence, but as a sign of the final apocalypse. The bonds of community, already frayed by fear, snapped completely. Neighbor turned against neighbor. If someone in the house next door developed a cough, the instinct was not to help, but to accuse, to report them to the few remaining city guards, hoping to have them sealed inside, sacrificed for the greater good. Suspicion and paranoia became the new social currency. And then there was the abandonment, the most unnatural symptom of this societal sickness. We heard Boccaccio's chilling words. Fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, as though they were not their own. Try to truly comprehend that. The primal, biological imperative to protect one's offspring simply vanished. A mother would hear her child crying with fever in the next room, and her instinct for self-preservation would overwhelm 1,000,000 years of evolution. She would lock the door. She would flee. The sick were left utterly alone. If they were wealthy, perhaps a servant, tempted by a king's ransom in wages, might agree to stay, pushing food and water into the room with a long stick. But even these servants often took the money and then fled at the first sign of a cough. More often, the sick died in silence, their only company the rats rustling in the walls. Commerce, the very reason these cities existed, ground to a halt. The great workshops of the wool guilds in Flanders fell silent. The looms were still. The dyes dried in their vats. The masters and apprentices were dead or hiding. The intricate network of trade that connected Venice to London, Paris to Constantinople, simply ceased to function. Ships rotted at anchor in the harbours, their captains afraid to sail, their crews unwilling to load cargo that might carry the invisible death. Money lost its meaning. What could you buy when the baker was dead and the market stalls were empty? Barter, the most ancient form of exchange, likely returned in pockets, but even that required trust, and trust was the plague's first casualty. The economy didn't just crash, it evaporated. Into this landscape of death and desertion stepped a new, necessary, and terrifying figure, the bacchino, the corpse carrier. These were not priests. They were not doctors. They were often the lowest of the low. Criminals released from prison, beggars, outcasts, people so destitute they had literally nothing left to lose. They were hired by the city, paid exorbitant sums, often looted directly from the homes of the dead they collected, to perform the one essential service that could not be ignored, removing the bodies. They worked mostly at night, their faces often covered with cloths soaked in vinegar. They pushed crude wooden carts through the empty, echoing streets, their voices hoarse from shouting the same dreadful phrase over and over, "Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!" Families, those few still capable of functioning, would hear the cry. They would perform the final, terrible act of love, dragging the stiff, cold body of their child or spouse out of the house and leaving it on the doorstep, like refuse. The bacchini, often drunk to numb themselves to the horror and the stench, would arrive. They handled the bodies with a rough indifference, using hooks or ropes to hoist them onto the cart, piling them high, men, women, infants, rich, poor, all jumbled together in a grotesque tangle of limbs. These men were both essential and despised. They were seen as unclean, as harbingers of death, as ghouls profiting from misery. Yet, without them, the cities would have literally drowned in their own dead. They were the final, grim symbol of the collapse. The task of burying the dead, once a sacred family and community ritual, had been outsourced to the lowest dregs of society. And where did the Bacini take their gruesome cargo? To the plague pits. These were not graves, they were wounds in the earth. Huge rectangular trenches dug hastily in fields outside the city walls, often in land consecrated by a desperate bishop, waving his hands over the unholy site. The carts would back up to the edge, and the bodies would be tipped in, tumbling down into the darkness. There was no order, no ceremony, just the thud of bodies hitting bodies, followed by a shovelful of quicklime and dirt. Then the next cart would arrive, layer upon layer, hundreds, sometimes thousands, packed into a single pit until it was full to the brim. Archaeologists excavating these pits today still find the evidence of this chaos. Skeletons crammed together in unnatural positions, limbs broken, skulls crushed. The final resting place was as anonymous and brutal as the death itself. The psychological landscape mirrored the physical one. As earthly authority dissolved, people grasped for any explanation, any source of power. This is when the flagellant movement, which had initially flared and faded, experienced a resurgence in some areas. If the Pope couldn't save them, if the King couldn't save them, perhaps these bloody, self-proclaimed saints could. Their processions, however, often devolved into mob violence, their theological fervour easily twisting into accusations against outsiders, particularly the Jews, further fueling the pogroms. They were a symptom of the collapse, not a cure. Agriculture, the foundation of the entire medieval world, faltered. In the countryside, entire villages were wiped out. Fields lay fallow, overgrown with weeds. Livestock wandered untended, their owners dead. The intricate system of planting, harvesting, and storing grain simply broke down. This led, in the years immediately following the first wave, to localized famines. Even those who had survived the plague now faced starvation. The complex web of dependencies that defined feudal agriculture, lord providing land, peasant providing labor, had been shredded. The very soundscape of life changed. Before, a city was a symphony of human activity. The cries of vendors, the hammering of artisans, the laughter from taverns, the constant murmur of conversation. Now, there was silence. A heavy, unnatural quiet, broken only by the tolling of church bells, until there were too few living to ring them, and then, only by the wind whistling through empty streets, the distant wail of a mourner, and the nightly dreaded cry of the Bacini. It was a world hollowed out, a civilization brought to its knees, not by armies or invasions, but by an enemy it could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. The collapse was total. It was economic, social, political, and spiritual. It seemed like the end, the final, terrible unraveling of everything. But even in the deepest pits, even amidst the silence and the despair, something else was happening. Something was being born from the decay. The very act of survival, the very fact that anyone was left standing, was beginning to plant the seeds of a new, unimaginable future. The collapse was not just an ending, it was, in its own terrible way, a clearing. And the question now was, what would grow in the ruins? The chaos could not last forever. Humanity, even when brought to the absolute brink, possesses a strange, stubborn instinct, not just to survive, but to organize. When the prayers failed, when the flagellation brought only more death, when the doctors threw up their hands in despair, a different kind of human response began, slowly, painfully, to emerge. It was not born in the cathedrals or the universities. It was born in the counting houses and the council chambers of the cities that lived and died by trade. It was the birth of control. The great maritime republics of Italy, Venice, Genoa, Florence, Ragusa were the first to be hit by the plague, arriving as it did on their own merchant ships. They were also the first to realize that this catastrophe was not just a spiritual crisis, but a practical, logistical nightmare that threatened their very existence. Their wealth, their power, their entire civilization was built on the free movement of goods and people, and that very movement was now the engine of their destruction. If they were to survive, they could not simply pray. They had to act. They had to find a way to manage the unmanageable. One of the earliest and most revolutionary sparks of this new thinking ignited not in the grand centers of power, but in a smaller, strategically vital city on the Dalmatian coast, Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik. Ragusa was a prosperous republic, a key trading link between Venice and the east. Its position made it incredibly vulnerable. In 1377, nearly 3 decades after the first devastating wave, the plague returned, carried once more by ships arriving from the Levant. The city fathers watched in horror as the familiar pattern began to repeat itself. But this time, they did something different. Led by their chief physician, a man named Jacob of Padua, a figure whose name deserves to be remembered, alongside the great scientists, the ruling council made a decision based not on superstition or theology, but on simple, brutal observation. The logic was undeniable. The sickness comes from the ships. The sickness takes time to manifest itself in a person. Therefore, if we stop the ships before the sickness shows, maybe we can stop it from entering the city. It sounds simple to us now. In 1377, it was revolutionary. It was the first glimmer of understanding contagion, not as a divine curse or a poisonous air, but as something carried, something transmitted over time and distance. The council issued a decree. It stated that any ship arriving in Ragusa from a plague-affected area, or any area suspected of being affected, would not be allowed to dock immediately. Instead, the ship, its crew, its passengers and its cargo had to anchor at a designated island offshore, and they had to wait. They had to wait for 30 days, a Trentino. Only after 30 days had passed, and if no one on board had shown signs of the sickness, would they be allowed to enter the city and conduct their business. This was the birth certificate of organized public health. This was the first state-mandated, systematic attempt to control the spread of an epidemic through isolation. It was not based on miasma theory. It was based on observing the incubation period of the disease, even if they didn't have the words for it. The impact was immediate. While not foolproof, the Trentino significantly reduced the frequency and severity of plague outbreaks in Ragusa compared to its neighbors. The news spread through the trading networks. Other cities, desperate for any solution, began to take notice. The greatest of these was Ragusa's powerful rival and trading partner, Venice. Venice, La Serenissima, the Queen of the Adriatic, had perhaps suffered more than any other city from the recurring plagues. Its very lifeblood was maritime trade. Its harbour was the busiest in the world, and its dense network of canals and islands made it uniquely vulnerable. The Venetians, masters of administration and pragmatism, saw the potential in Ragusa's experiment. They adopted it, and then they perfected it. They extended the waiting period from 30 days to 40, a quarantino. Why 40? The reasons are debated. 40 is a number heavy with biblical significance, the 40 days of Lent, the 40 days of Noah's flood, the 40 years the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. Perhaps the Venetians felt this longer period offered greater spiritual protection. Or perhaps, through bitter experience, their health officials had simply observed that 30 days was sometimes not quite long enough for the disease to reveal itself. Whatever the reason, the number stuck. And from the Venetian quarantino, we derive our modern word, quarantine. But Venice did not stop there. Simple isolation at anchor was not enough. They needed infrastructure. They needed control. In 1423, the Venetian Senate authorized the creation of something the world had never seen before, the first lazaretto. They chose a small, isolated island in the lagoon, Santa Maria di Nazareth, later corrupted to Nazaretto, and then combined with the name Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers, to become Lazaretto. On this island, they built a dedicated facility. This was not just a holding pen, it was a plague hospital. It was a place specifically designed to house and treat, or rather, house and contain those suffering from the pestilence, away from the healthy population of the city. This Lazaretto Vecchio, Old Lazaretto, soon proved insufficient. So, the Venetians built another, larger facility on a different island, Lazaretto Nuovo, New Lazaretto. This one was different. It was not primarily for the sick, it was for the suspected. This was the true quarantine station. Lazaretto Nuovo became a marvel of early modern bureaucracy and control. Imagine a ship arriving in Venice in the 15th century. It would be met in the lagoon not by welcoming merchants, but by health officials in their terrifying bird masks. The ship's captain would have to present his bill of health, another Venetian innovation, a document issued at the port of origin, hopefully certifying that the crew and cargo were free from plague. If the bill of health was suspect, or if the ship came from a known plague zone, or if even one sailor showed suspicious symptoms, the entire vessel was ordered to Lazaretto Nuovo. Life on the Lazaretto was a grim, highly regulated affair. Passengers and crew were disembarked and assigned to different buildings based on their perceived risk. They were under constant guard. Their clothes were taken away and fumigated, baked in ovens, or washed in vinegar. The cargo itself was subjected to elaborate purification rituals. Bales of wool would be aired out for weeks. Grain would be sifted. Letters would be smoked over fires of aromatic herbs and pierced with small holes to allow the bad air to escape. And all the while, the health officials, the Provveditori alla Sanità, kept meticulous records. They noted who arrived, from where, when their quarantine began, who developed symptoms, who died, who recovered. These fragile parchment documents, many still preserved in the Venetian archives, are the birth records of epidemiology. They represent the first systematic attempt to track a disease, to understand its patterns, its timing, its victims, not through prayer or astrology, but through data. The lazarettos were not pleasant places. They were essentially prisons, fueled by fear. But they worked. Venice, despite its constant exposure, managed to survive and even thrive through centuries of recurring plague, in large part because of this ruthless, organized system of surveillance and control. Other Italian cities followed suit, developing their own variations. Florence established a powerful Magistrato di Sanità, a health board with near-dictatorial powers during outbreaks. They could impose curfews, shut down markets, requisition buildings, and condemn property. They employed an army of officials, doctors, guards, corpse-bearers, inspectors who enforced the city's plague regulations with absolute authority. This was the birth of the public health state, the idea that the government had not just the right, but the duty, to interfere in the lives of its citizens, to restrict their movement, seize their property, even confine them against their will, all in the name of collective safety. And sometimes, this new power took truly horrific forms. In Milan, during the devastating outbreak of 1576, the city's health authorities, under the influence of the zealous Cardinal Borromeo, implemented a policy of terrifying finality. When a case of plague was identified in a house, they did not just quarantine the sick, they sealed the entire house. Masons were dispatched. They bricked up the doors and windows, sometimes leaving only a small opening through which meager supplies could be passed. Everyone inside the sick, the healthy, the children, the elderly was entombed alive. Guards were posted outside to ensure no one escaped. The screams from within those sealed houses became part of the city's soundscape. It was a calculated sacrifice. The logic was brutal. Better to sacrifice one household, even the healthy within it, than to risk the infection spreading to the entire city. Contemporary accounts describe the horror. Cardinal Borromeo himself, a man torn between his duty to save souls and his perceived duty to save the city, wrote of Milan becoming a vast prison where the sentence was always death. Yet, paradoxically, the Milan method, as it came to be known, appeared effective. Milan's death toll in that outbreak remained significantly lower than in cities like Venice, which relied on less extreme isolation. This success, bought at such an appalling human cost, sent a chilling message across Europe. It suggested that absolute, ruthless control could conquer the plague. It became a model, debated and sometimes imitated, influencing plague policies for centuries. It demonstrated the terrifying lengths to which the state would go, armed with the new mandate of public health. These measures, the quarantine, the lazarettos, the health boards, the sealed houses, were not cures. They did not stop Yersinia pestis, but they managed it. They slowed its spread. They contained its outbreaks. They turned an unpredictable existential terror into a known, albeit dreadful, administrative problem. Humanity had learned to fight back, not with prayer or potions, but with walls, with guards, with lists, and with laws. They had begun to build a fortress against the plague, not of stone, but of bureaucracy. This was a monumental achievement, born from centuries of suffering. It laid the foundation for all modern public health, for our own responses to pandemics today. But this new power, this ability of the state to control life and death in the name of the collective good, came at a cost. The fight against the invisible enemy outside inadvertently created new forms of control inside. The walls built to keep the plague out also served to lock people in. The question lingered, long after the plague fires died down. Had humanity, in learning to cage the monster of pestilence, also begun to build a cage for itself? What happened to the individual when the state decided who lived, who died, and who would be sealed behind a wall of bricks? The fires eventually died down. The plague pits were covered over, becoming anonymous green mounds in the landscape. The terrible silence in the cities began to be broken, not by the wailing of the dying, but by the hesitant sounds of life returning. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer finding a new apprentice, the cry of a market vendor selling to fewer customers, the laughter of children who had somehow, miraculously, survived. Europe had passed through the crucible, but the continent that emerged on the other side, around the year 1351, was not the same one that had entered the darkness just 5 years earlier. It was emptier, it was quieter, and it was fundamentally, irrevocably, reordered. The world had been turned upside down. Imagine walking through the English countryside in 1352. The most striking thing is the emptiness. Entire villages stand deserted, their thatched roofs collapsing, their fields choked with weeds. Where once there were 100 families working the land, now there might be 20. Sheep, their wool thick and matted, wander untended through overgrown pastures. Ploughs lie rusting in the furrows where their owners dropped them and died. Before 1347, the central fact of European life was a surplus of people and a scarcity of land. For centuries, the population had grown steadily, pressing against the limits of agriculture. Land was precious, fought over by nobles, hoarded by the church. Human life, on the other hand, was cheap, especially the life of a peasant, a serf, bound to the land by law and tradition, his labor belonging not to himself, but to his lord. The Black Death, in its horrifying efficiency, flipped that equation completely. Suddenly, land was everywhere. Vast estates lay vacant, their noble lines extinguished, their fields unworked. But people were the new gold. Labor was the scarcest, most valuable commodity on the continent. A lord might sit in his castle, surveying 1,000 acres of fertile land, but without hands to work it, that land was worthless. He couldn't eat the dirt. He couldn't wear the weeds. He needed ploughmen. He needed reapers. He needed shepherds. And the few who remained knew it. This realization didn't dawn overnight in a philosophical treatise. It happened in the fields, in the villages, in the quiet calculations of ordinary men and women who had survived the apocalypse. Let's picture a peasant. Let's call him Will, working his family's ancestral strip of land on a manor in Kent, before the plague. His life was one of endless toil for meagre reward. He owed days of labor each week to the Lord, tending the Lord's fields before his own. He couldn't leave the manor without permission. He couldn't marry without the Lord's approval. His life was circumscribed by a web of obligations stretching back generations. But now, his 2 brothers are dead. His father is dead. Half the families in his village are gone. The lord of the manor himself died, along with his eldest son, leaving a young, inexperienced heir struggling to manage the estate. One day, Will hears a rumor. A traveler passing through speaks of the next manor over. The lord there, desperate for workers, is offering something unthinkable: wages, real silver coin, paid daily, for anyone willing to work his fields. Not just wages, but high wages, double what a free laborer might have earned before the plague. And more than that, freedom. No labor dues, no requirement to grind your grain at his mill, just work for pay. Will faces a choice no one in his family has ever faced before. He can stay, bound by tradition to his ancestral land and its diminished lord, or he can simply leave. He packs his few belongings, his tools, a spare tunic, and under the cover of darkness he walks away. He doesn't ask permission. Who is left to stop him? The old manor court, which used to enforce the rules, hasn't met in months because the steward and half the jurors are dead. Will is voting with his feet, and all across Europe, millions like him are making the same choice. The lords, the ruling class, watched this happen with a mixture of disbelief and panic. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was an existential threat to their entire way of life. Their power, their wealth, their very identity was based on the control of land and the labor bound to it. If the peasants could simply walk away, if they could demand wages, the whole system collapsed. Their response was swift, predictable, and utterly futile. In England, in 1351, King Edward III, with the full backing of Parliament, composed almost entirely of landowners, enacted the Statute of Labourers. This law was a breathtaking attempt to legislate reality out of existence. It declared that all wages must be frozen at the levels they were before the plague. Specifically, in the year 1346, it was illegal for any lord to offer higher wages. It was illegal for any worker to demand higher wages. It was illegal for any able-bodied man or woman under the age of 60 who did not have land of their own to refuse work if offered at the legal rate. Workers were forbidden from leaving their parish in search of better pay. It was in essence an attempt to legally reshackle the peasantry, to force the economic genie back into its bottle through sheer force of law. It failed, completely. The economic forces unleashed by the plague were simply too powerful. You cannot legislate against supply and demand when the supply of labour has been cut in half. Lords, desperate to get their harvests in before they rotted, quietly ignored the law. They paid the high wages under the table. They offered hidden bonuses, extra food, better housing, exemption from certain dues to attract and keep workers. Peasants, emboldened by their newfound leverage, continued to move, seeking the best possible deal. If one lord tried to enforce the statute, they simply walked to the next manor where the lord was more pragmatic. The law was widely hated, seen by the common people for exactly what it was, an attempt by the rich and powerful to hoard the benefits of the post-plague world and deny them their fair share. Enforcement was spotty and created enormous resentment. The chains of serfdom, already weakening in some parts of Europe before the plague, now began to rust through at an accelerated pace. The old system of labour dues and obligations started to be replaced by cash rents and wage labour. Peasants became tenants, paying their lord in coin rather than sweat. Or they became free labourers, selling their skills to the highest bidder. This wasn't universal, and it didn't happen overnight. Serfdom would linger in Eastern Europe for centuries, but in England, France, and parts of Italy, the Black Death dealt it a mortal blow. The economic revolution wasn't just about wages, it was about opportunity. With so much land vacant, peasants could suddenly acquire more land than their ancestors could have dreamed of. They could consolidate scattered strips into larger, more efficient farms. They could afford to buy livestock oxen for ploughing, sheep for wool at bargain prices, as the untended herds flooded the market. For the first time, a significant portion of the peasantry could produce a surplus. They could earn profit. They could accumulate savings. They could invest in better tools, better seed. A new class began to emerge from the ruins. The yeoman farmer, independent, relatively prosperous, and increasingly unwilling to bow and scrape before the old nobility. And then there was the matter of inheritance. The plague was a brutal, efficient redistributor of wealth. Imagine a wealthy merchant family in Florence. Before the plague, the family fortune might have been destined to be divided among 5 sons. After the plague, perhaps only one son, or even a distant nephew, remained. Suddenly, that entire fortune, the houses, the workshops, the investments, the cash was concentrated in the hands of a single individual. This happened at every level of society. Fortunes were made, not through shrewd business deals, but through sheer, grim luck of survival. This sudden, massive injection of inherited capital destabilized the old order. It weakened the landed aristocracy, whose wealth was tied up in unproductive land. It massively empowered the urban classes, the merchants, the bankers, the skilled artisans whose wealth was more liquid and who were better positioned to capitalize on the new economic realities. Families like the Medici in Florence rose to prominence in this dynamic, chaotic environment, using their banking fortunes to gain political power and, eventually, to fund the artistic explosion of the Renaissance. The world had been turned upside down. The peasants were demanding rights. The merchants were becoming princes. The old certainties, the rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval life for 1,000 years, were dissolving. This did not happen peacefully. The Statute of Laborers and similar laws passed across Europe bred a deep, simmering anger. The survivors felt cheated. They had lived through hell. They had inherited a world of opportunity. And now the powers that be were trying to snatch it away from them. This resentment fueled a new kind of thinking. Preachers like the radical John Ball began traveling the English countryside, asking dangerous questions. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? His message was simple and explosive. The entire system of nobility and serfdom was an unnatural fraud. All men were created equal in the eyes of God. This potent cocktail of economic grievance and radical ideology finally erupted in violence. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, sparked by an unpopular tax but fueled by decades of post-plague resentment, saw tens of thousands march on London, demanding an end to serfdom and the execution of corrupt officials. Though brutally suppressed, the revolt sent a shockwave through the ruling class. The message was clear. The old ways were unsustainable. The world had changed. The Black Death did not cause these changes directly. It did not whisper ideas of equality into peasant ears. What it did was act as a ferocious catalyst. It shattered the existing structures, creating a vacuum and unleashing economic forces that accelerated trends already underway. It cleared the board, violently and completely, allowing new players and new rules to emerge. The survivors found themselves in a world that was both terrifyingly empty and dizzyingly full of possibility. The rigid pyramid of the feudal world had cracked, and through those cracks, the first light of a new, more fluid, more individualistic, and far more turbulent era was beginning to dawn. The world turned upside down was not just a world of death. It was, paradoxically, a world pregnant with rebirth. But what kind of world would it be? And who would inherit it? The bodies were cleared. The cities began to breathe again. The economic and social order of Europe had been shattered and was slowly, painfully being rebuilt. It felt like the end of the story. The great trauma was over. But the Black Death wasn't just an event in history. It became an event inside us. It reached deeper than stone walls, deeper than social structures, deeper even than memory. It reached into the very code of life itself. The plague did not just kill, it chose. Think of it like this. The years between 1347 and the end of the century were the single largest, most brutal, uncontrolled experiment in natural selection ever conducted on the human species. The entire continent of Europe was the laboratory. Yersinia pestis was the experimental condition, and the result was us. We, the descendants of those who lived through that fire, are different. The plague left a scar, not just on our culture, not just on our history books, but deep within our own DNA. How is this possible? Remember, the plague was terrifyingly lethal, but it was not universally fatal. Even in the worst-hit areas, some people survived. Alessandro, our fictional Florentine merchant whose bubo burst, walked away. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's own physician, contracted the plague and recovered. Why? Was it just luck? Did they happen to encounter a less virulent strain? Did they have better nutrition? Perhaps. Those factors certainly played a role. But science, in recent decades, has uncovered a far more profound, more startling explanation. Some people survived because they were biologically different. They carried, purely by chance, a subtle variation in their genetic code that gave them an edge, a microscopic shield against the perfect killer. These survivors, the ones who walked out of the charnel houses while their neighbors perished, were the ones who went on to have children, and they passed that protective genetic trait down. Their children were more likely to survive the next plague outbreak, which came just a decade or two later, and their children, even more so. Over generations, century after century of recurring plague, the European gene pool was quietly, permanently edited. The genetic variations that offered no protection were weeded out, ruthlessly. The variations that offered even a slight advantage became more and more common. The Black Death was an evolutionary bottleneck. It squeezed the genetic diversity of Europe, selecting for resilience against this specific, terrifying enemy. So, what was this genetic shield? The most dramatic, and best understood, example lies in a tiny alteration to a single gene. It is a gene that tells our body how to build a protein called CCR5. Think of CCR5 as a doorknob. It sits on the surface of some of our most important immune cells, our white blood cells. Like any doorknob, its purpose is to allow things, specifically certain signaling molecules, to enter the cell and communicate messages. It is a vital part of our immune system's communication network. But doorknobs can also be used by unwanted visitors. Certain viruses and bacteria have learned, over millennia, how to pick the lock of the CCR5 protein and use it as a doorway to invade our immune cells. Now, deep in the human past, long before the Black Death, a random mutation occurred in someone, somewhere in Europe. It was a small error in the genetic code, a typo. A specific sequence of 32 DNA letters was accidentally deleted from the CCR5 gene. This mutation is called CCR5 delta 32. This deletion had a simple, profound consequence. The doorknob was broken. People who inherit one copy of this mutated gene from one parent produce CCR5 proteins that are slightly malformed. People who inherit two copies, one from each parent, produce no functional CCR5 protein at all. Their immune cells simply lack that specific doorknob on their surface. For thousands of years, this mutation likely drifted through the European population at very low levels. It didn't seem to offer any major advantage or disadvantage. It was just there, a piece of random genetic noise, until Yersinia pestis arrived. Here's where the story takes a fascinating, though still debated, turn. The exact mechanism isn't fully proven, but the evidence is compelling. It seems that the CCR5 protein, that doorknob on our immune cells, plays a role, perhaps a crucial one, in how Yersinia pestis does its devastating work. Maybe the bacterium uses CCR5 as one of its entry points into the immune cells it needs to conquer. Or maybe the CCR5 protein is involved in the catastrophic immune overreaction, the septic shock, that ultimately kills the plague victim. Whatever the precise link, the result seems clear from the genetic record. People carrying the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, especially those with two copies, had a significantly better chance of surviving the Black Death. Their broken doorknob somehow interfered with the plague's perfect strategy. It threw a wrench into the works of the perfect killer. Suddenly, this rare, random mutation became the most valuable genetic lottery ticket in human history. As the plague swept through Europe, generation after generation, it acted like a scythe, cutting down those without the mutation far more efficiently than those who carried it. The frequency of CCR5 delta 32 inches the European population began to climb. Before the Black Death, perhaps only 1 inch 20,000 people carried it. After centuries of plague, that number soared. Today, in some parts of northern Europe, descended from populations hit hardest and longest by the recurring plagues, as many as 1 inch 10 people carry at least one copy of the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. It is a living genetic fossil. It is a testament, written in our own blood cells, to the selective power of that medieval pandemic. The Black Death literally reshaped the genetic landscape of Europe. But the story does not end there, because this broken doorknob, this ancient shield forged in the fires of the 14th century, had an entirely unforeseen, almost miraculous, consequence in our own time. Fast forward 600 years, a new plague appears, a different kind of killer, a virus this time, HIV. Scientists racing to understand HIV discovered something crucial. How does the virus actually get inside our immune cells, the very cells it needs to destroy? It picks a lock. It uses a specific protein receptor on the surface of T cells as its primary doorway. And that doorway is CCR5. Suddenly, researchers noticed something astonishing. A small percentage of people, primarily those of European descent, seemed naturally immune to HIV infection. They could be exposed repeatedly, but the virus simply couldn't gain a foothold. The reason? They carried two copies of the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. Their immune cells lacked the doorknob. HIV had no way in. Think about the staggering implication of this. The very same genetic quirk that may have helped our medieval ancestors survive the bacterial onslaught of the Black Death now provides robust protection against the viral scourge of AIDS. It is an evolutionary echo across centuries, a biological gift from the survivors of one apocalypse to the potential victims of another. The people who walked out of the plague pits did not just pass down their trauma, they passed down a modified key to survival, a genetic legacy whose true value would only become apparent 600 years later. Is CCR5 Delta 32 the only genetic scar left by the plague? Almost certainly not. The Black Death was such an extreme selective event. It likely influenced dozens, perhaps hundreds, of other genes related to our immune system. Modern geneticists are actively hunting for these other echoes. They are comparing the DNA of plague victims, extracted from teeth found in those mass graves, with the DNA of modern Europeans. They are finding subtle differences in genes involved in inflammation, in pathogen recognition, in immune signaling. This research is rewriting our understanding of human evolution. It suggests that our immune systems are not static. They are living historical documents, shaped and reshaped by the great pandemics of the past. The Black Death, in its terrible power, acted as a brutal editor, highlighting certain genetic sentences and deleting others. But this raises a final, unsettling thought. Evolution is not about progress. It is about adaptation to a specific environment. The genetic changes that protected our ancestors against Yersinia pestis might not be purely beneficial today. Some researchers speculate that the very same hyperreactive immune system genes that helped fight off the plague might now predispose descendants to autoimmune diseases, conditions like Crohn's disease or rheumatoid arthritis, where the immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own tissues. Could our strength against the ancient enemy have created a new vulnerability within ourselves? The scar in our DNA is real. It is a mark of resilience, a testament to the fact that life finds a way. But it is also a reminder that the past is never truly past. The ghosts of 1347 are not just in the history books or the ruins of deserted villages. They are inside us. They are in the intricate dance of proteins on the surface of our cells. The Black Death changed what it means, biologically, to be human, and we are still living with the consequences, both miraculous and potentially perilous. The story is not over. The experiment continues. And the question remains, what other secrets, what other scars, are hidden within our own blood, waiting to be read? The Great Plagues, the ones that emptied cities and brought Europe to its knees, eventually faded. The last major outbreak in Western Europe flickered out in Marseille in 1720. The recurring nightmare seemed finally to be over. Brick and stone replaced timber and thatch in the cities. The brown rat, less prone to living in human homes, began to displace the black rat. Sanitation, slowly, painfully, began to improve. Science, armed with microscopes and germ theory, started to unravel the mystery. It felt like victory. Humanity had faced its greatest biological enemy, and after 4 centuries of terror, had finally won. But this is mystery history, and the neat endings, the tidy victories, they are often illusions. The truth is far more unsettling. Yersinia pestis never went away. It did not disappear. It did not go extinct. It simply retreated. It went back into the shadows, back into the wild reservoirs, the vast, hidden communities of rodents that still exist all over the planet, in the American Southwest, in the highlands of Africa, across the steppes of Asia where it all began. The ancient pact between bacterium, flea, and rodent never ended. It just became quieter. Most people believe the Black Death is history, a horror story from a distant, dirtier past, something safely confined to museums and textbooks. They are wrong. In 2017, an outbreak of pneumonic plague, the airborne ghost, the deadliest form, swept through Madagascar. Over 2,000 people were infected. More than 200 died. This was not in 1317. This was less than a decade ago. In the United States, the Centers for Disease Control reports an average of 7 human plague cases each year, mostly in rural areas of the West. People camping. People whose pets encounter infected prairie dogs or squirrels. In 2015, 4 Americans died from the plague. It is rare, yes. Thanks to modern antibiotics, it is usually treatable if caught early. But it is here. The perfect killer is not extinct. It is dormant. It is waiting. And the chilling reality is, our modern world, in some ways, makes us more vulnerable than our medieval ancestors, not less. Think about the speed. In the 14th century, the plague travelled at the speed of a ship or a merchant's cart, 2.5 miles a day. It took 5 years to cross Europe. Today, a person incubating the pneumonic plague, feeling perfectly healthy, can board a plane in, say, Arizona, where the bacteria are endemic in rodents. They can cough once, releasing that invisible, deadly aerosol. 24 hours later, they can be in London, Tokyo, Sydney, seeding new outbreaks before anyone even knows they are sick. Our hyper-connected world, the very thing that drives our global economy, is the most efficient pandemic delivery system imaginable. And what about the bacterium itself? Yersinia pestis is a living organism. It evolves. The strains circulating today are descendants of the medieval killer, but they are not identical. And bacteria are masters of adaptation. They develop resistance to antibiotics. The drugs that work today might not work tomorrow. Scientists worry constantly about the emergence of a multi-drug resistant strain of plague. If that happens, we are suddenly thrown back into a world not unlike 1347, armed with sophisticated science, but potentially facing a killer we can no longer kill. Then there is the darkest echo of all. The question we began with, the question of intent. We know that in the 20th century, nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, successfully weaponized Yersinia pestis. They developed methods to grow it in vast quantities, to make it resistant to antibiotics, to turn it into an aerosol that could be sprayed over enemy cities. These programs were officially dismantled, but the knowledge exists. The potential exists. Could the ancient terror of Kaffa, the deliberate use of plague as a weapon, return in a far more terrifying modern form? The Black Death taught humanity the brutal necessity of public health, of quarantine, of tracking disease, but it also taught us about ourselves. It revealed the fragility of civilization. It showed how quickly fear can curdle into blame, how easily societies can fracture, how readily we turn on each other when faced with an enemy we cannot see. The plague never truly left us. The bacterium still exists in the wild, a vast, unseen reservoir of potential death. The genetic scars it left are still carried in our DNA. And the societal vulnerabilities it exploited, our interconnectedness, our tendency towards panic and blame, are perhaps even greater today than they were 7 centuries ago. We think we are safe. We have science. We have medicine. We have walled ourselves into cities of concrete and steel, believing we have shut the monster out. But the perfect killer is patient. It has waited before, and the history books are full of walls that failed. The question is not if another great pandemic will come. The question is what form it will take, and whether the lessons written in the plague pits of the 14th century have truly been learned, or merely forgotten, waiting to be taught again. Sleep well.